Furvidni, Skapa, Specky. Welcome to Evil Bedtime Stories. I'm your host, Ravendude. The following video contains strong language and dark subjects. It's also terrible, and no one should watch or listen to it, ever. If you want to support your favorite Skald of Cthulhu, shove my content down the throats of everyone you know, violently. I also have an 11-hour-long video covering my recording, editing, and pontificating like an ass over the first story I ever narrated on my channel. It's available for $1 through Patreon, Ko-fi, and YouTube channel membership at Evil Bedtime Stories, linked down in the description. Thank you for joining me on my path of curiosity, creativity, and wisdom. Do you like Evil Bedtime Stories? Worms of the Earth, a Bran McMorn story by Robert E. Howard. Chapter 1. Strike in the nails, soldiers, and let our guest see the reality of our good Roman justice. The speaker wrapped his purple cloak closer about his powerful frame and settled back into his official chair, much as he might have settled back in his seat at the Circus Maximus to enjoy the clash of gladiatorial swords. Realization of power colored his every move. Wedded pride was necessary to Roman satisfaction, and Titus Sulla was justly proud, for he was military governor of Eboracum and answerable only to the Emperor of Rome. He was a strongly built man of medium height, with the hawk-like features of the purebred Roman. Now a mocking smile curved his full lips, increasing the arrogance of his haughty aspect. Distinctly military in appearance, he wore the golden-scaled corselet and chased breastplate of his rank, with the short stabbing sword at his belt, and he held on his knee the silvered helmet with his plumed crest. Behind him stood a clump of impassive soldiers with shield and spear, blonde titans from the Rhineland. Before him was taking place the scene which apparently gave him so much real gratification. A scene common enough wherever stretched the far-flung boundaries of Rome. A rude cross lay flat upon the barren earth, and on it was bound a man, half naked, wild of aspect with his corded limbs, glaring eyes, and shock of tangled hair. His executioners were Roman soldiers, and with heavy hammers they prepared to pin the victim's hands and feet to the wood with iron spikes. Only a small group of men watched this ghastly scene. In the dread place of execution beyond the city walls, the governor and his watchful guards, a few young Roman officers, the man to whom Sulla had referred as guest, and who stood like a bronze image, unspeaking. Beside the gleaming splendor of the Roman, the quiet garb of this man seemed drab, almost somber. He was dark, but he did not resemble the Latins around him. There was about him none of the warm, almost oriental sensuality of the Mediterranean which colored their features. The blonde barbarians behind Sulla's chair were less unlike the man in facial outline than were the Romans. Not his were the full curving red lips, nor the rich waving locks suggestive of the Greek, nor was his dark complexion the rich olive of the south. Rather, it was the bleak darkness of the north. The whole aspect of the man vaguely suggested the shadowed mists, the gloom, the cold and the icy winds of the naked northern lands. Even his black eyes were savagely cold, like black fires burning through fathoms of ice. His height was only medium, But there was something about him which transcended mere physical bulk. A certain fierce, innate vitality, comparable only to that of a wolf or a panther. In every line of his supple, compact body, as well as in his coarse, straight hair and thin lips, this was evident. In the hawk-like set of the head on the corded neck, in the broad, square shoulders, in the deep chest, the lean loins, the narrow feet. Built with the savage economy of a panther, he was an image of dynamic potentialities, pent in with iron self-control. At his feet crouched one like him in complexion, but there the resemblance ended. This other was a stunted giant, with gnarly limbs, thick body, a low, sloping brow, and an expression of dull ferocity, now clearly mixed with fear. If the man on the cross resembled, in a tribal way, the man Titus Sulla called Guest, he far more resembled the stunted, crouching giant. "Well, Partha Mac Othna," said the governor with studied effrontery, "when you return to your tribe, you will have a tale to tell of the justice of Rome, who rules the south." "I will have a tale," answered the other in a voice which betrayed no emotion, just as his dark face, schooled to immobility, showed no evidence of the maelstrom in his soul. "Justice to all under the rule of Rome," said Sulla. "Pax Romana, reward for virtue, punishment for wrong." He laughed inwardly at his own black hypocrisy, then continued. "You see, emissary of Pictland, how swiftly Rome punishes the transgressor." "I see," answered the Pict, in a voice which strongly curbed anger made deep with menace, "that the subject of a foreign king is dealt with as though he were a Roman slave." "He has been tried and condemned in an unbiased court," retorted Sulla. "Aye, and the accuser was a Roman, the witnesses Roman, the judge Roman. He committed murder. In a moment of fury, he struck down a Roman merchant who cheated, tricked, and robbed him, and to injury added insult. Aye, and a blow. Is his king but a dog, that Rome crucifies his subjects at will, condemned by Roman courts? Is his king too weak or foolish to do justice, were he informed and formal charges brought against the offender?" "Well," said Sulla cynically, "you may inform Bran MacMorn yourself. Rome, my friend, makes no account of her actions to barbarian kings. When savages come among us, let them act with discretion or suffer the consequences." The Pict shut his iron jaws with a snap that told Sulla further badgering would elicit no reply. The Roman made a gesture to the executioners. One of them seized a spike, and placing it against the thick wrist of the victim, smote heavily. The iron point sank deep through the flesh, crunching against the bones. The lips of the man on the cross writhed, though no moan escaped him. As a trapped wolf fights against his cage, the bound victim instinctively wrenched and struggled. The veins swelled in his temples, sweat beaded his low forehead. The muscles in arms and legs writhed and knotted. The hammers fell in inexorable strokes, driving the cruel points deeper and deeper through wrists and ankles. Blood flowed in a black river over the hands that held the spikes, staining the wood of the cross, and the splintering of bones was distinctly heard. Yet the sufferer made no outcry, though his blackened lips writhed back until the gums were visible, and his shaggy head jerked involuntarily from side to side. The man called Parthamac stood like an iron image, eyes burning from an inscrutable face, his whole body hard as iron from the tension of his control. At his feet crouched his misshapen servant, hiding his face from the grim sight, his arms locked about his master's knees. Those arms gripped like steel, and under his breath the fellow mumbled ceaselessly, as if in invocation. The last stroke fell. The cords were cut from arm and leg, so that the man would hang supported by the nails alone. He had ceased his struggling that only twisted the spikes in his agonizing wounds. His bright black eyes, unglazed, had not left the face of the man called Parthamac. In them lingered a desperate shadow of hope. Now the soldiers lifted the cross and set the end of it in the hole prepared, stamped the dirt about it to hold it erect. The Pict hung in midair, suspended by the nails in his flesh, but still no sound escaped his lips. His eyes still hung on the somber face of the emissary, but the shadow of hope was fading. "He'll live for days," said Sulla cheerfully. "These Picts are harder than cats to kill. I'll keep a guard of 10 soldiers watching night and day to see that no one takes him down before he dies. Ho there, Valerius, in honor of our esteemed neighbor, King Bran MacMorn, give him a cup of wine." With a laugh, the young officer came forward, holding a brimming wine cup, and rising on his toes, lifted it to the parched lips of the sufferer. In the black eyes flared a red wave of unquenchable hatred. Writhing his head aside to avoid even touching the cup, he spat full into the young Roman's eyes. With a curse, Valerius dashed the cup to the ground, and before any could halt him, wrenched out his sword and sheathed it in the man's body. Sulla rose with an imperious exclamation of anger. The man called Parthamac had started violently, but he bit his lip and said nothing. Valerius seemed somewhat surprised at him as he sullenly cleansed his sword. The act had been instinctive, following the insult to Roman pride, the one thing unbearable. "Give up your sword, young sir!" exclaimed Sulla. "Centurion Publius, place him under arrest. A few days in a cell with stale bread and water will teach you to curb your patrician pride in matters dealing with the will of the Empire. What, you young fool? Do you not realize that you could not have made the dog a more kindly gift? Who would not rather desire a quick death on the sword than the slow agony on the cross? Take him away. And you, Centurion, see that guards remain at the cross so that the body is not cut down until the ravens pick bare the bones. Parthamac, I go to a banquet at the house of Demetrius. Will you not accompany me?" The emissary shook his head, his eyes fixed on the limp form which sagged on the black-stained cross. He made no reply. Sulla smiled sardonically, then rose and strode away, followed by his secretary who bore the gilded chair ceremoniously, and by the stolid soldiers, with whom walked Valerius, head sunken. The man called Parthamac flung a wide fold of his cloak about his shoulder, halted a moment to gaze at the grim cross with its burden, darkly etched against the crimson sky, where the clouds of night were gathering. Then he stalked away, followed by his silent servant. Chapter 2. In an inner chamber of Eboricum, the man called Parthamak Othna paced tigerishly to and fro. His sandaled feet made no sound on the marble tiles. "Grom!" He turned to the gnarled servant. "Well, I know why you held my knees so tightly. Why you muttered aid of the Moon Woman. You feared I would lose my self-control and make a mad attempt to succor that poor wretch. By the gods, I believe that was what that dog Roman wished. His iron-cased watchdogs watched me narrowly, I know, and his baiting was harder to bear than ordinarily. Gods black and white, dark and light." He shook his clenched fists above his head in the black gust of his passion. "That I should stand by and see a man of mine butchered on a Roman cross, without justice, and with no more trial than that farce. Black gods of Relea, even you would I invoke to the ruin and destruction of those butchers. I swear by the nameless ones, men shall die howling for that deed, and Rome shall cry out as a woman in the dark who treads upon an adder." "He knew you, master," said Grom. The other dropped his head and covered his eyes with a gesture of savage pain. "His eyes will haunt me when I lie dying. Aye, he knew me, and almost until the last, I read in his eyes the hope that I might aid him. Gods and devils, is Rome to butcher my people beneath my very eyes? Then I am not king, but dog." "Not so loud, in the name of all the gods!" exclaimed Grom in affright. "Did these Romans suspect you were Bran MacMorn, they would nail you on a cross beside that other." "They will know it ere long," grimly answered the king. "Too long I have lingered here in the guise of an emissary, spying upon mine enemies. They have thought to play with me, these Romans, masking their contempt and scorn only under polished satire. Rome is courteous to barbarian ambassadors. They give us fine houses to live in, offer us slaves, pander to our lusts with women and gold and wine and games. But all the while they laugh at us. Their very courtesy is an insult, and sometimes, as today, their contempt discards all veneer. Bah! I've seen through their baitings, have remained imperturbably serene, and swallowed their studied insults. But this, by the fiends of hell, this is beyond human endurance. My people look to me. If I fail them, if I fail even one, even the lowest of my people, who will aid them? To whom shall they turn? By the gods, I'll answer the jibes of these Roman dogs with black shaft and trenchant steel." "And the chief with the plumes?" Grom meant the governor, and his gutturals thrummed with the bloodlust. "He dies?" He flicked out a length of steel. Bran scowled. "Easier said than done. He dies. But how may I reach him? By day his German guards keep at his back. By night they stand at door and window. He has many enemies, Romans as well as barbarians. Many a Briton would gladly slit his throat." Grom seized Bran's garment. Stammering his fierce eagerness broke the bonds of his inarticulate nature. "Let me go, master. My life is worth nothing. I will cut him down in the midst of his warriors." Bran smiled fiercely and clapped his hand on the stunted giant's shoulder with a force that would have felled a lesser man. "Nay, old war dog, I have too much need of thee. You shall not throw your life away uselessly. Sulla would read the intent in your eyes. Besides, and the javelins of his Teutons would be through you ere you could reach him. Not by the dagger in the dark will we strike this Roman. Not by the venom in the cup, nor the shaft from the ambush. The king turned and paced the floor a moment, his head bent in thought. Slowly his eyes grew murky with a thought so fearful he did not speak it aloud to the waiting warrior. I have become somewhat familiar with the maze of Roman politics during my stay in this accursed waste of mud and marble, said he. During a war on the wall, Titus Sulla, as governor of this province, is supposed to hasten thither with his centuries. But this Sulla does not do. He is no coward, but the bravest avoid certain things. To each man, however bold, his own particular fear. So he sends in his place Caius Camillus, who in times of peace patrols the fens of the west, lest the Britons break over the border. And Sulla takes his place in the Tower of Trajan. Ha! He whirled and gripped Grom with steely fingers. Grom, take the red stallion and ride north. Let no grass grow under the stallion's hoofs. Ride to Cormac Neconict and tell him to sweep the frontier with sword and torch. Let his wild gales feast their fill of slaughter. After a time I will be with him, but for a time I have affairs in the west. Grom's black eyes gleamed, and he made a passionate gesture with his crooked hand, an instinctive move of savagery. Bran drew a heavy bronze seal from beneath his tunic. This is my safe conduct as an emissary to Roman courts, he said grimly. It will open all gates between this house and Baldur. If any official questions you too closely, here. Lifting the lid of an iron-bound chest, Bran took out a small, heavy leather bag which he gave into the hands of the warrior. When all keys fail at a gate, said he, try a golden key. Go now. There were no ceremonious farewells between the barbarian king and his barbarian vassal. Grom flung up his arm in a gesture of salute. Then turning, he hurried out. Bran stepped to a barren window and gazed out into the moonlit streets. Wait until the moon sets, he muttered grimly. Then I'll take the road to hell. But before I go, I have a debt to pay. The stealthy clink of a hoof on the flags reached him. With the safe conduct and gold, not even Rome can hold a Pictish reaver, muttered the king. Now I'll sleep until the moon sets. With a snarl at the marble friezwork and fluted columns as symbols of Rome, he flung himself down on a couch, from which he had long since impatiently torn the cushions and silk stuffs as too soft for his hard body. Hate and the black passion of vengeance seethed in him, yet he went instantly to sleep. The first lesson he had learned in his bitter, hard life was to snatch sleep any time he could, like a wolf that snatches sleep on the hunting trail. Generally, his slumber was as light and dreamless as a panther's. But tonight, it was otherwise. He sank into fleecy gray fathoms of slumber, and in a timeless, misty realm of shadows, he met the tall, lean, white-bearded figure of old Gunnar, the priest of the moon, high counselor to the king. And Bran stood aghast, for Gunnar's face was white as driven snow, and he shook as with ague. Well might Bran stand appalled, for in all the years of his life he had never before seen Gunnar the Wise show any sign of fear. "What now, old one?" asked the king. "Goes all well in Baldur?" "All is well in Baldur where my body lies sleeping," answered old Gunnar. "Across the void I have come to battle with you for your soul. King, are you mad? This thought you have thought in your brain." "Gunnar," answered Bran somberly. "This day I stood still and watched a man of mine die on the cross of Rome. What his name or his rank, I do not know. I do not care. He might have been a faithful unknown warrior of mine. He might have been an outlaw. I only know that he was mine. The first scents he knew were the scents of the heather. The first light he saw was the sunrise of the Pictish hills. He belonged to me, not to Rome. If punishment was just, then none but me should have dealt it. If he were to be tried, none but me should have been his judge. The same blood flowed in our veins. The same fire maddened our brains. In infancy, we listened to the same old tales, and in youth, we sang the same old songs. He was bound to my heartstrings, as every man and every woman and every child of Pictland is bound. It was mine to protect him. Now it is mine to avenge him." "But in the name of the gods, Bran," expostulated the wizard, "take your vengeance in another way. Return to the heather. Mass your warriors. Join with Cormac and his Gales, and spread a sea of blood and flame the length of the Great Wall." "All that I will do," grimly answered Bran. "But now, I will have a vengeance such as no Roman ever dreamed of. Ha! What do they know of the mysteries of this ancient isle, which sheltered strange life long before Rome rose from the marshes of the Tiber? Bran, there are weapons too foul to use, even against Rome." Bran barked short and sharp as a jackal. "Ha! There are no weapons I would not use against Rome. My back is at the wall. By the blood of the fiends, has Rome fought me fair? Pah! I am a barbarian king with a wolfskin mantle and an iron crown, fighting with my handful of bows and broken pikes against the queen of the world. What have I? The heather hills, the wattle huts, the spears of my shock-headed tribesmen. And I fight Rome, with her armored legions, her broad fertile plains and rich seas, her mountains and her rivers and her gleaming cities, her wealth, her steel, her gold, her majesty, and her wrath. By steel and fire I will fight her, and by subtlety and treachery, by the thorn in the foot, the adder in the path, the venom in the cup, the dagger in the dark. Aye." His voice sank somberly. "And by the worms of the earth." "But it is madness," cried Gunnar. "You will perish in the attempt you plan. You will go down to hell and you will not return. What of your people then?" "If I cannot serve them, I had better die," growled the king. "But you cannot even reach the beings you seek," cried Gunnar. "For untold centuries they have dwelt apart. There is no door by which you can come to them. Long ago they severed the bonds that bound them to the world we know." "Long ago," answered Bran somberly. "You told me that nothing in the universe was separated from the stream of life. A saying the truth of which I have often seen evident. No race, no form of life, but is close-knit somehow, by some manner, to the rest of life and the world. Somewhere there is a thin link connecting those I seek to the world I know. Somewhere there is a door, and somewhere among the bleak fens of the west I will find it." Stark horror flooded Gunnar's eyes, and he gave back crying, "Woe, woe, woe to Pictum! Woe to the unborn kingdom! Woe! Black woe to the sons of men! Woe! Woe! Bran awoke to a shadowed room and the starlight on the windowed bars. The moon had sunk from sight, though its glow was still faint above the housetops. Memory of his dream shook him, and he swore under his breath. Rising, he flung off cloak and mantle, donning a light shirt of black mesh mail, and girding on sword and dirk. Going again to the iron-bound chest, he lifted several compact bags and emptied the clinking contents into the leathern pouch at his girdle. Then, wrapping his wide cloak about him, he silently left the house. No servants there were to spy on him. He had impatiently refused the offer of slaves, which it was Rome's policy to furnish her barbarian emissaries. Gnarled Grom had attended to all Bran's simple needs. The stables fronted on the courtyard. A moment's groping in the dark and he placed his hand over a great stallion's nose, checking the nicker of recognition. Working without a light, he swiftly bridled and saddled the great brute, and went through the courtyard into a shadowy side street, leading him. The moon was setting, the border of floating shadows widening along the western wall. Silence lay on the marble palaces and mud hovels of Eboracum under the cold stars. Bran touched the pouch at his girdle, which was heavy with minted gold that bore the stamp of Rome. He had come to Eboracum posing as an emissary of Pictum, to act the spy. But being a barbarian, he had not been able to play his part in aloof formality and sedate dignity. He retained a crowded memory of wild feasts, where wine flowed in fountains, of white-bosomed Roman women, who, sated with civilized lovers, looked with something more than favor on a virile barbarian, of gladiatorial games, and of other games where dice clicked and spun, and tall stacks of gold changed hands. He had drunk deeply and gambled recklessly, after the manner of barbarians, and he had had a remarkable run of luck, due possibly to the indifference with which he won or lost. Gold to the Pict was so much dust, flowing through his fingers. In his land, there was no need of it. But he had learned its power in the boundaries of civilization. Almost under the shadow of the northwestern wall, he saw ahead of him loom the great watchtower, which was connected with and reared above the outer wall. One corner of the castle-like fortress, farthest from the wall, served as a dungeon. Bran left his horse standing in a dark alley, with the reins hanging on the ground, and stole like a prowling wolf into the shadows of the fortress. The young officer Valerius had awakened from a light, unquiet sleep by a stealthy sound at the barred window. He sat up, cursing softly under his breath as the faint starlight which etched the window bars fell across the bare stone floor and reminded him of his disgrace. Well, in a few days, he ruminated, he'd be well out of it. Sulla would not be too harsh on a man with such high connections. Then let any man or woman jibe at him. Damn that insolent Pict! But wait, he thought suddenly, remembering. What of the sound which had roused him? Sst! It was a voice from the window. Why so much secrecy? It could hardly be a foe, yet why should it be a friend? Valerius rose and crossed his cell, coming close to the window. Outside all was dim in the starlight, and he made out but a shadowy form close to the window. Who are you? He leaned close against the bars, straining his eyes into the gloom. His answer was a snarl of wolfish laughter. A long flicker of steel in the starlight. Valerius reeled away from the window and crashed to the floor, clutching his throat, gurgling horribly as he tried to scream. Blood gushed through his fingers, forming about his twitching body a pool that reflected the dim starlight dully and redly. Outside, Bran glided away like a shadow, without pausing to peer into the cell. In another minute, the guards would round the corner on their regular routine. Even now, he heard the measured tramp of their ironclad feet. Before they came in sight, he had vanished, and they clumped stolidly by the cell window with no intimation of the corpse that lay on the floor within. Bran rode to the small gate in the western wall, unchallenged by the sleepy watch. What fear of foreign invasion in Eboracum, and certain well-organized thieves and women stealers made it profitable for the watchmen not to be too vigilant. But the single guardsman at the western gate, his fellows lay drunk in a nearby brothel, lifted his spear and bawled for Bran to halt and give an account of himself. Silently, the Pict reined closer. Masked in the dark cloak, he seemed dim and indistinct to the Roman, who was only aware of the glitter of his cold eyes in the gloom. But Bran held up his hand against the starlight, and the soldier caught the gleam of gold. In the other hand, he saw a long sheen of steel. The soldier understood, and he did not hesitate between the choice of a golden bribe or a battle to the death with this unknown rider who was apparently a barbarian of some sort. With a grunt, he lowered his spear and swung the gate open. Bran rode through, casting a handful of coins to the Roman. They fell about his feet in a golden shower, clinking against the flags. He bent in greedy haste to retrieve them, and Bran Mak Morn rode westward like a flying ghost in the night. Chapter 3. Into the dim fens of the west came Bran Mak Morn. A cold wind breathed across the gloomy waste, and against the gray sky, a few herons flapped heavily. The long reeds and marsh grass waved in broken undulations, and out across the desolation of the wastes, a few still meres reflected in the dull light. Here and there rose curiously regular hillocks above the general levels, and gaunt against the somber sky, Bran saw a marching line of upright monoliths, menhirs, reared by what nameless hands. A faint blue line to the west lay the foothills that beyond the horizon grew to the wild mountains of Wales, where dwelt still wild Celtic tribes fierce, blue-eyed men that knew not the yoke of Rome. A row of well-garrisoned watchtowers held them in check. Even now, far away across the moors, Bran glimpsed the unassailable keep men called the Tower of Trajan. These barren wastes seemed the dreary accomplishment of desolation, yet human life was not utterly lacking. Bran met the silent men of the fen, reticent, dark of eye and hair, speaking a strange mixed tongue whose long blended elements had forgotten their pristine separate sources. Bran recognized a certain kinship in these people to himself, but he looked on them with the scorn of a pure-blooded patrician for men of mixed strains. Not that the common people of Caledonia were altogether pure-blooded. They got their stocky bodies and massive limbs from a primitive Teutonic race, which had found its way into the northern tip of the Isle, even before the Celtic conquest of Britain was completed, and had been absorbed by the Picts. But the chiefs of Bran's folk had kept their blood from foreign taint since the beginnings of time, and he himself was of purebred Pict of the old race. But these fenmen, overrun repeatedly by British, Gaelic, and Roman conquerors, had assimilated blood of each, and in the process almost forgotten their original language and lineage. For Bran came of a race that was very old, which had spread over Western Europe in one vast, dark empire, before the coming of the Aryans, when the ancestors of the Celts, the Hellenes, and the Germans were one primal people, before the days of tribal splitting off in westward drift. Only in Caledonia, Bran brooded, had his people resisted the flood of Aryan conquest. He had heard of a Pictish people called Basques, who in the crags of the Pyrenees called themselves an unconquered race. But he knew that they had paid tribute for centuries to the ancestors of the Gaels, before these Celtic conquerors abandoned their mountain realm and set sail for Ireland. Only the Picts of Caledonia had remained free, and they had been scattered into small feuding tribes. He was the first acknowledged king in 500 years. The beginning of a new dynasty. No, a revival of an ancient dynasty under a new name. In the very teeth of Rome, he dreamed his dreams of empire. He wandered through the fens, seeking a door. Of his quest, he said nothing to the dark-eyed fenmen. They told him news that drifted from mouth to mouth, a tale of war in the north, the skirl of war pipes along the winding wall, of gathering fires in the heather, of flame and smoke and rapine and the glutting of Gaelic swords in the crimson sea of slaughter. The eagles of the legions were moving northward, and the ancient road resounded to the measured tramp of the ironclad feet. And Bran, in the fens of the west, laughed, well pleased. In Eboracum, Titus Sulla gave secret word to seek out the Pictish emissary with the Gaelic name, who had been under suspicion, and who had vanished the night young Valerius was found dead in his cell with his throat ripped out. Sulla felt that this sudden bursting flame of war on the wall was connected closely with his execution of a condemned Pictish criminal, and he set his spy system to work, though he felt sure that Parthamek Othna was by this time far beyond his reach. He prepared to march from Eboracum, but he did not accompany the considerable force of legionaries which he sent north. Sulla was a brave man, but each man has his own dread, and Sulla's was Cormac Neconict, the black-haired prince of the Gaels, who had sworn to cut out the governor's heart and eat it raw. So Sulla rode with his ever-present bodyguard westward, where lay the Tower of Trajan with its warlike commander, Caius Camillus, who enjoyed nothing more than taking his superior's place when the red waves of war washed at the foot of the wall. Devious politics. But the legate of Rome seldom visited this far isle, and what of his wealth and intrigues, Titus Sulla was the highest power in Britain. And Bran, knowing all this, patiently waited his coming in the deserted hut in which he had taken up his abode. One gray evening he strode on foot across the moors, a stark figure, blackly etched against the dim crimson fire of the sunset. He felt the incredible antiquity of the slumbering land as he walked like the last man on the day after the end of the world. Yet at last he saw a token of human life. A drab hut of wattle and mud, set in the reedy breast of the fen. A woman greeted him from the open door, and Bran's somber eyes narrowed with a dark suspicion. The woman was not old, yet the evil wisdom of ages was in her eyes. Her garments were ragged and scanty, her black locks tangled and unkempt, lending her an aspect of wildness well in keeping with her grim surroundings. Her red lips laughed, but there was no mirth in her laughter, only a hint of mockery, and under the lips her teeth showed sharp and pointed like fangs. "Enter, master," said she. if you do not fear to share the roof of the witch woman of Dagon Moor." Bran entered silently and sat him down on a broken bench while the woman busied herself with the scanty meal cooking over an open fire on the squalid hearth. He studied her lithe, almost serpentine motions, the ears which were almost pointed, the yellow eyes which slanted curiously. "What do you seek in the fens, my lord?" she asked, turning toward him with a supple twist of her whole body. "I seek a door," he answered, chin resting on his fist. "I have a song to sing to the worms of the earth." She started upright, a jar falling from her hands to shatter on the hearth. "This is an ill saying, even spoken in chants," she stammered. "I speak not by chance, but by intent," he answered. She shook her head. "I know not what you mean." "Well, you know," he returned. "Aye, you know well. My race is very old. They reigned in Britain before the nations of the Celts and the Hellenes were born out of the womb of peoples. But my people were not first in Britain. By the mottles on your skin, by the slanting of your eyes, by the taint in your veins, I speak with full knowledge and meaning." A while she stood silent, her lips smiling, but her face inscrutable. "Man, are you mad?" she asked. "That in your madness you come seeking that from which strong men fled screaming in old times?" "I seek a vengeance," he answered, "that can be accomplished only by them I seek." She shook her head. "You have listened to a bird singing. You have dreamed empty dreams." "I have heard a viper hiss," he growled, "and I do not dream. Enough of this weaving of words. I came seeking a link between two worlds. I have found it." "I need lie to you no more, man of the North," answered the woman. "They you seek still dwell beneath the sleeping hills. They have drawn apart, farther and farther from the world you know. But they still steal forth in the night to grip women straying on the moors," said he, his gaze on her slanted eyes. She laughed wickedly. "What would you of me?" "That you bring me to them." She flung back her head with a scornful laugh. His left hand locked like iron in the breast of her scanty garment, and his right closed on his hilt. She laughed in his face. "Strike and be damned, my northern wolf! Do you think that such life as mine is so sweet that I would cling to it as a babe to the breast?" His hand fell away. "You are right. Threats are foolish. I will buy your aid." "How?" The laughing voice hummed with mockery. Bran opened his pouch and poured into his cupped palm a stream of gold. "More wealth than the men of the fen ever dreamed of." Again she laughed. "What is this rusty metal to me? Save it for some white-breasted Roman woman who will play the traitor for you." "Name me a price," he urged. "The head of an enemy. By the blood in my veins, with its heritage of ancient hate, who is mine enemy but thee?" She laughed, and springing, struck cat-like. But her dagger splintered on the mail beneath his cloak, and he flung her off with a loathsome flit of his wrist, which tossed her sprawling across her grass-strewn bunk. Lying there, she laughed up at him. "I will name you a price then, my wolf, and it may be in days to come you will curse the armor that broke Atlas' dagger." She She rose and came close to him, her disquietingly long hands fastened fiercely into his cloak. "I will tell you, Black Bran, King of Caledon. Oh, I knew you when you came into my hut with your black hair and your cold eyes. I will lead you to the doors of hell if you wish, and the price shall be the kisses of a king. What of my blasted and bitter life, I, whom mortal men loathe and fear? I have not known the love of men, the clasp of a strong arm, the sting of human kisses. I, Atla, the werewoman of the moors. What have I known but the lone winds of the fen, the dreary fire of cold sunsets, the whispering of the marsh grasses, the faces that blink up at me in the waters of the meres, the footpad of night things in the gloom, the glimmer of red eyes, the grisly murmur of nameless beings in the night. I am half human at least. Have I not known sorrow and yearning and crying wistfulness and the drear ache of loneliness? Give to me, King. Give me your fierce kisses and your hurtful barbarian's embrace. Then in the long drear years to come I shall not utterly eat out my heart in vain envy of the white-bosomed women of men, for I shall have a memory few of them can boast. The kisses of a king. One night of love, O King, and I will guide you to the gates of hell." Bran eyed her somberly. He reached forth and gripped her arm in his iron fingers. An involuntary shudder shook him at the feel of her sleek skin. He nodded slowly, and drawing her close to him, forced his head down to meet her lifted lips. Chapter 4. The cold gray mists of dawn wrapped King Bran like a clammy cloak. He turned to the woman whose slanted eyes gleamed in the gray gloom. "Make good your part of the contract," he said roughly. "I sought a link between worlds, and in you I found it. I seek the one thing sacred to them. It shall be the key opening the door that lies unseen between me and them. Tell me how I can reach it." "I will." The red lips smiled terribly. "Go to the mound men call Dragon's Barrow. Draw aside the stone that blocks the entrance, and go under the dome of the mound. The floor of the chamber is made of 7 great stones, 6 grouped about the 7th. Lift out the center stone, and you will see." "Will I find the black stone?" he asked. "Dragon's Barrow is the door to the black stone," she answered. "If you dare follow the road." "Will the symbol be well guarded?" He unconsciously loosened his blade in its sheath. The red lips curled mockingly. "If you meet any on the road, you will die as no mortal man has died for long centuries. The stone is not guarded, as men guard their treasures. Why should they guard what man has never sought? Perhaps they will be near, perhaps not. It is a chance you must take if you wish the stone. Beware, King of Pictum. Remember it was your folk who, so long ago, cut the thread that bound them to human life. They were almost human then. They overspread the land and knew the sunlight. Now they have drawn apart. They know not the sunlight, and they shun the light of the moon. Even the starlight they hate. Far, far apart have they drawn. Who might have been men in time, but for the spears of your ancestors." The sky was overcast with misty gray, through which the sun shone coldly yellow when Bran came to Dagon's Barrow, a round hillock overgrown with rank grass of a curious fungoid appearance. On the eastern side of the mound showed the entrance of a crudely built stone tunnel, which evidently penetrated the barrow. One great stone blocked the entrance to the tomb. Bran laid hold of the sharp edges and exerted all his strength. It held fast. He drew his sword and worked the blade between the blocking stone and the sill. Using the sword as a lever, he worked carefully and managed to loosen the great stone and wrench it out. A foul charnel house scent flowed out of the aperture, and the dim sunlight seemed less to illuminate the cavern-like opening than to be fouled by the rank darkness which clung there. Sword in hand, ready for he knew not what, Bran groped his way into the tunnel, which was long and narrow, built up of heavy-joined stones, and was too low for him to stand erect. Either his eyes became somewhat accustomed to the gloom, or the darkness was, after all, somewhat lightened by the sunlight filtering in through the entrance. At any rate, he came into a round, low chamber and was able to make out its general dome-like outline. Here, no doubt, in old times, had reposed the bones of him for whom the stones of the tomb had been joined, and the earth heaped high above them. But now of those bones no vestige remained on the stone floor. And bending close and straining his eyes, Bran made out the strange, startlingly regular pattern of that floor. 6 well-cut slabs, clustered about a 7th, 6-sided stone. He drove his sword point into a crack and pried carefully. The edge of the central stone tilted slightly upward. A little work, and he lifted it out and leaned it against the curving wall. Straining his eyes downward, he saw only the gaping blackness of a dark well, with small, worn steps that led downward and out of sight. He did not hesitate. Though the skin between his shoulders crawled curiously, he swung himself into the abyss and felt the clinging blackness swallow him. Groping downward, he felt his feet slip and stumble on steps too small for human feet. With one hand pressed hard against the side of the well, he steadied himself, fearing a fall into unknown and unlighted depths. The steps were cut into solid rock, yet they were greatly worn away. The farther he progressed, the less like steps they became, mere bumps of worn stone. Then the direction of the shaft changed sharply. It still led down, but at a shallow slant down which he could walk, elbows braced against the hollowed sides, head bent low beneath the curved roof. The steps had ceased altogether, and the stone felt slimy to the touch, like a serpent's lair. What beings, Bran wondered, had slithered up and down this slanting shaft for how many centuries? The tunnel narrowed until Bran found it rather difficult to shove through. He lay on his back and pushed himself along with his hands, feet first. Still, he knew he was sinking deeper and deeper into the very guts of the earth. How far below the surface he was, he dared not contemplate. Then, ahead, a faint witch-fire gleam tinged the abysmal blackness. He grinned savagely, and without mirth. If they he sought came suddenly upon him, how could he fight in that narrow shaft? But he had put the thought of personal fear behind him when he began this hellish quest. He crawled on, thoughtless of all else but his goal. And he came at last into a vast space where he could stand upright. He could not see the roof of the place, but he got an impression of dizzying vastness. The blackness pressed in on all sides, and behind him he could see the entrance to the shaft from which he had just emerged, a black well in the darkness. But in front of him, a strange, grisly radiance glowed about a grim altar built of human skulls. The source of that light he could not determine, but on the altar lay a sullen, night-black object, the Black Stone. Bran wasted no time in giving thanks that the guardians of the grim relic were nowhere near. He caught up the stone, and gripping it under his left arm, crawled into the shaft. When a man turns his back on peril, its clammy menace looms more grisly than when he advances upon it. So Bran, crawling back up the nighted shaft with his grisly prize, felt the darkness turn on him and slink beneath him, grinning with dripping fangs. Clammy sweat beaded his flesh, and he hastened to the best of his ability, ears strained for some stealthy sound to betray that fell shapes were at his heels. Strong shudders shook him, despite himself, and the short hair on his neck prickled as if a cold wind blew at his back. When he reached the first of the tiny steps, he felt as if he had attained to the outer boundaries of the mortal world. Up them he went, stumbling and slipping, and with a deep gasp of relief came out into the tomb, whose spectral grayness seemed like the blaze of noon in comparison to the Stygian depths he had just traversed. He replaced the central stone and strode into the light of the outer day, and never was the cold yellow light of the sun more grateful, as it dispelled the shadows of black-winged nightmares of fear and madness that seemed to have ridden him up out of the black deeps. He shoved the great blocking stone back into place, and picking up the cloak he had left at the mouth of the tomb, he wrapped it about the black stone and hurried away, a strong revulsion and loathing shaking his soul and lending wings to his strides. A gray silence brooded over the land. It was desolate as the blind side of the moon, yet Bran felt the potentialities of life under his feet in the brown earth, sleeping. But how soon to waken, and in what horrific fashion? He came through the tall masking reeds to the still deep men called Dagon's Mere. No slightest ripple ruffled the cold blue water to give evidence of the grisly monster legend said dwelt beneath. Bran closely scanned the breathless landscape. He saw no hint of life, human or unhuman. He sought the instincts of his savage soul to know if any unseen eyes fixed their lethal gaze upon him, and found no response. He was alone, as if he were the last man alive on Earth. Swiftly, he unwrapped the black stone, and as it lay in his hands like a solid, sullen block of darkness, he did not seek to learn the secret of its material, nor scan the cryptic characters carved thereon. Weighing it in his hands and calculating the distance, he flung it far out, so that it fell almost exactly in the middle of the lake. A sullen splash, and the waters closed over it. There was a moment of shimmering flashes on the bosom of the lake. Then the blue surface stretched pallid and unrippled again. Chapter 5. The werewoman turned swiftly as Bran approached her door. Her slant eyes widened. "You? And alive? And sane?" "I have been into hell and I have returned," he growled. "What is more, I have that which I sought." "The Black Stone!" she cried. "You really dared steal it! Where is it?" "No matter. But last night my stallion screamed in his stall, and I heard something crunch beneath his thundering hoofs, which was not the wall of the stable. and there was blood on his hoofs when I came to see, and blood on the floor of the stall. And I have heard stealthy sounds in the night, and noises beneath my dirt floor, as if worms burrowed deep in the earth. They know I have stolen their stone. Have you betrayed me?" She shook her head. "I keep your secret. They do not need my word to know you. The farther they have retreated from the world of men, the greater have grown their powers in other, uncanny ways. Some dawn your hut will stand empty, and if men dare investigate, they will find nothing, except crumbling bits of earth on the dirt floor." Bran smiled terribly. "I have not planned and toiled thus far to fall prey to the talons of vermin. If they strike me down in the night, they will never know what became of their idol, or whatever it be to them. I would speak with them. Dare you come with me and meet them in the night?" she asked. "Thunder of all gods!" he snarled. "Who are you to ask me if I dare? Lead me to them and let me bargain for a vengeance this night. The hour of retribution draws nigh. This day I saw silvered helmets and bright shields gleam across the fens. The new commander has arrived at the Tower of Trajan, and Caius Camillus has marched to the wall." That night the king went across the dark desolation of the moors with the silent werewoman. The night was thick and still, as if the land lay in ancient slumber. The stars blinked vaguely, mere points of red struggling through the unbreathing gloom. Their gleam was dimmer than the glitter in the eyes of the woman who glided beside the king. Strange thoughts shook Bran, vague, titanic, primeval. Tonight, ancestral linkings with these slumbering fens stirred in his soul and troubled him with the phantasmal, eon-veiled shapes of monstrous dreams. The vast age of his race was born upon him, where now he walked an outlaw and an alien. Dark-eyed kings in whose mold he was cast had reigned in old times. The Celtic and Roman invaders were as strangers to this ancient isle beside his people. Yet his race likewise had been invaders, and there was an older race than his, a race whose beginnings lay lost and hidden back beyond the dark oblivion of antiquity. Ahead of them loomed a low range of hills, which formed the easternmost extremity of those straying chains which far away climbed at last to the mountains of Wales. The woman led the way up what might have been a sheep path, and halted before a wide, black, gaping cave. "A door to those you seek, O king." Her laughter rang hateful in the gloom. "Dare ye enter?" His fingers closed in her tangled locks, and he shook her viciously. "Ask me but once more if I dare, and your head and shoulders part company. Lead on." Her laughter was like sweet, deadly venom. They passed into the cave, and Bran struck flint and steel. The flicker of the tinder showed him a wide, dusty cavern, on the roof of which hung clusters of bats. Lighting a torch, he lifted it and scanned the shadowy recesses, seeing nothing but dust and emptiness. "Where are they?" he growled. She beckoned him to the back of the cave and leaned against the rough wall, as if casually. But the king's keen eyes caught the motion of her hand pressing hard against a projecting ledge. He recoiled as a round black well gaped suddenly at his feet. Again, her laughter slashed him like a keen silver knife. He held the torch to the opening, and again saw small worn steps leading down. "They do not need those steps," said Atla. "Once they did, before your people drove them into the darkness. But you will need them. She thrust the torch into a niche above the well. It shed a faint red light into the darkness below. She gestured into the well, and Bran loosened his sword and stepped into the shaft. As he went down into the mystery of the darkness, the light was blotted out above him, and he thought for an instant Atla had covered the opening again. Then he realized that she was descending after him. The descent was not a long one. Abruptly, Bran felt his feet on a solid floor. Atla swung down beside him and stood in the dim circle of light that drifted down the shaft. Bran could not see the limits of the place into which he had come. "Many caves in these hills," said Atla, her voice sounding small and strangely brittle in the vastness, "are but doors to greater caves which lie beneath, even as a man's words and deeds are but small indications of the dark caverns of murky thought lying behind and beneath." And now Bran was aware of movement in the gloom. The darkness was filled with stealthy noises not like those made by any human foot. Abruptly, sparks began to flash and float in the blackness, like flickering fireflies. Closer they came, until they girdled him in a wide half-moon. And beyond the ring gleamed other sparks, a solid sea of them, fading away in the gloom until the farthest were mere tiny pinpoints of light. And Bran knew that they were the slanted eyes of the beings who had come upon him in such numbers that his brain reeled at the contemplation and at the vastness of the cavern. Now that he faced his ancient foes, Bran knew no fear. He felt the waves of terrible menace emanating from them, the grisly hate, the inhuman threat to body, mind, and soul. More than a member of a less ancient race, he realized the horror of his position. But he did not fear, though he confronted the ultimate horror of the dreams and legends of his race. His blood raced fiercely, but it was with the hot excitement of the hazard, not the drive of terror. "They know you have the stone, O King," said Atla. And though he knew she feared, though he felt her physical efforts to control her trembling limbs, there was no quiver of fright in her voice. "You are in deadly peril. They know your breed of old. Oh, they remember the days when their ancestors were men. I cannot save you. Both of us will die as no human has died for 10 centuries. Speak to them if you will. They can understand your speech, though you may not understand theirs. But it will avail not. You are human, and a Pict." Bran laughed, and the closing ring of fire shrank back at the savagery in his laughter. Drawing his sword with a soul-chilling rasp of steel, he set his back against what he hoped was a solid stone wall. Facing the glittering eyes with his sword gripped in his right hand and his dirk in his left, he laughed as a blood-hungry wolf snarls. He growled. "I am a Pict, a son of those warriors who drove your brutish ancestors before them like chaff before the storm, who flooded the land with your blood and heaped high your skulls for a sacrifice to the Moon Woman. You, who fled of old before my race, dare ye now snarl at your master? Roll on me like a flood now, if ye dare. Before your viper fangs drink my life, I will reap your multitudes like ripened barley. Of your severed heads I will build a tower, and of your mangled corpses I will rear up a wall. Dogs of the dark, vermin of hell, worms of the earth, rush in and try my steel. When death finds me in this dark cavern, your living will howl for the scores of your dead, and your black stone will be lost to you forever.
For only I know where it is hidden, and not all the tortures of all the hells can wring the secret from my lips."
Then followed a tense silence. Bran faced the firelit darkness, tensed like a wolf at bay, waiting the charge. At his side, the woman cowered, her eyes ablaze. Then, from the silent ring that hovered beyond the dim torchlight rose a vague, abhorrent murmur. Bran, prepared as he was for anything, started. Gods, was that the speech of creatures which had once been called men? Atlas straightened, listening intently. From her lips came the same hideous, soft sibilances. And Bran, though he had already known the grisly secret of her being, knew that never again could he touch her, save with soul-shaken loathing. She turned to him, a strange smile curving her red lips dimly in the ghostly light.
"They fear you, O king. By the black secrets of R'lyeh, who are you that hell itself quails before you? Not your steel, but the stark ferocity of your soul has driven unused fear into their strange minds. They will buy back the black stone at any price."
Good. Bran sheathed his weapons.
"They shall promise not to molest you because of your aid to me, and..."
His voice hummed like the purr of a hunting tiger.
"They shall deliver into my hands Titus Sulla, governor of Eboracum, now commanding the Tower of Trajan. This they can do. How, I know not. But I know that in the old days, when my people warred with these children of the night, babes disappeared from guarded huts, and none saw the stealers come or go. Do they understand?"
Again rose the low, frightful sounds, and Bran, who feared not their wrath, shuddered at their voices.
"They understand," said Atla. "Bring the black stone to Dagon's ring tomorrow night when the earth is veiled with the blackness that foreruns the dawn. Lay the stone on the altar. There, they will bring Titus Sulla to you. Trust them. They have not interfered in human affairs for many centuries, but they will keep their word."
Bran nodded, and turning, climbed up the stair with Atla close behind him. At the top, he turned and looked down once more. As far as he could see floated a glittering ocean of slanted yellow eyes upturned. But the owners of those eyes kept carefully beyond the dim circle of torchlight, and of their bodies he could see nothing. Their low, hissing speech floated up to him, and he shuddered as his imagination visualized not a throng of biped creatures, but a swarming, swaying myriad of serpents gazing up at him with their glittering, unwinking eyes. He swung into the upper cave, and Atla thrust the blocking stone back in place. It fitted into the entrance of the well with uncanny precision. Bran was unable to discern any crack in the apparently solid floor of the cavern. Atla made a motion to extinguish the torch, but the king stayed her. "Keep it so until we are out of the cave," he grunted. "We might tread on an adder in the dark." Atla's sweetly hateful laughter rose maddeningly in the flickering gloom. Chapter 6. It was not long before sunset when Bran came again to the reed-grown marge of Dagon's Mare. Casting cloak and sword belt on the ground, he stripped himself of his short leathern breeches. Then, gripping his naked dirk in his teeth, he went into the water with the smooth ease of a diving seal. Swimming strongly, he gained the center of the small lake, and turning, drove himself downward.
The mirror was deeper than he had thought. It seemed he would never reach the bottom, and when he did, his groping hands failed to find what he sought. A roaring in his ears warned him, and he swam to the surface. Gulping deep of the refreshing air, he dived again, and again his quest was fruitless. A third time he sought the depth, and this time his groping hands met a familiar object in the silt of the bottom. Grasping it, he swam up to the surface. The stone was not particularly bulky, but it was heavy. He swam leisurely, and suddenly was aware of a curious stir in the waters about him, which was not caused by his own exertions. Thrusting his face below the surface, he tried to pierce the blue depths with his eyes, and thought to see a dim, gigantic shadow hovering there. He swam faster, not frightened, but wary. His feet struck the shallows and he waded up on the shelving shore. Looking back, he saw the water swirl and subside. He shook his head, swearing. He had discounted the ancient legend which made Dagon's Mere the lair of a nameless water monster. But now he had a feeling as if his escape had been narrow. The time-worn myths of the ancient land were taking form and coming to life before his eyes. What primeval shape lurked below the surface of that treacherous mere, Bran could not guess. But he felt that the Fenmen had good reason for shunning the spot after all. Bran donned his garments, mounted the black stallion, and rode across the fens in the desolate crimson of the sunset's afterglow, with the black stone wrapped in his cloak. He rode, not to his hut, but to the west, in the direction of the Tower of Trajan and the Ring of Dagon. As he covered the miles that lay between, the red stars winked out. Midnight passed him in the moonless night, and still Bran rode on. His heart was hot for his meeting with Titus Sulla. Atla had gloated over the anticipation of watching the Roman writhe under torture, but no such thought was in the Pict's mind. The governor should have his chance with weapons. With Bran's own sword, he should face the Pictish King's dirk, and live or die according to his prowess. And though Sulla was famed throughout the provinces as a swordsman, Bran felt no doubt as to the outcome. Dagon's ring lay some distance from the tower, a sullen circle of tall, gaunt stones planted upright, with a rough-hewn stone altar in the center. The Romans looked on these menhirs with aversion. They thought the Druids had reared them, but the Celts supposed Bran's people, the Picts, had planted them. And Bran knew well what hands reared these grim monoliths in the lost ages, though for what reasons, he but dimly guessed. The king did not ride straight to the ring. He was consumed with curiosity as to how his grim allies intended carrying out their purpose. That they could snatch Titus Sulla from the very midst of his men, he felt sure, and he believed he knew how they would do it. He felt the gnawings of a strange misgiving, as if he had tampered with powers of unknown breadth and depth, and had loosed forces which he could not control. Each time he remembered that reptilian murmur, those slanted eyes of the night before. A cold breath passed over him. They had been abhorrent enough when his people drove them into the caverns under the hills, ages ago. What had long centuries of retrogression made of them? In their nighted, subterranean life, had they retained any of the attributes of humanity at all? Some instinct prompted him to ride toward the tower. He knew he was near. But for the thick darkness, he could have plainly seen its stark outline tusking the horizon. Even now, he should be able to make it out dimly. An obscure, shuddersome premonition shook him, and he spurred the stallion into swift canter. And suddenly, Bran staggered in his saddle as from a physical impact. So stunning was the surprise of what met his gaze. The impregnable Tower of Trajan was no more. Bran's astounded gaze rested on a gigantic pile of ruins, of shattered stone and crumbling granite, from which jutted the jagged and splintered ends of broken beams. At one corner of the tumbled heap, one tower rose out of the waste and crumbled masonry, and it leaned drunkenly as if its foundations had been half cut away. Bran dismounted and walked forward, dazed by bewilderment. The moat was filled in places by fallen stones and broken pieces of mortared wall. He crossed over and came among the ruins, where, he knew, only a few hours before the flags had resounded to the martial tramp of ironclad feet, and the walls had echoed to the clang of shields and the blast of the loud-throated trumpets, a horrific silence reigned. Almost under Bran's feet, a broken shape writhed and groaned. The king bent down to the legionary who lay in a sticky red pool of his own blood. A single glance showed the Pict that the man, horribly crushed and shattered, was dying. Lifting the bloody head, Bran placed his flask to the pulped lips, and the Roman instinctively drank deep, gulping through splintered teeth. In the dim starlight, Bran saw his glazed eyes roll. "The walls fell," muttered the dying man. "They crashed down like the skies falling on the day of doom. Oh, Jove, the skies rained shards of granite and hailstones of marble. I felt no earthquake shock." Bran scowled, puzzled. "It was no earthquake," muttered the Roman. "Before last dawn it began. The faint, dim scratching and clawing far below the earth. We of the guard heard it, like rats burrowing, or like worms hollowing out the earth. Titus laughed at us, but all day long we heard it. Then at midnight, the tower quivered and seemed to settle, as if the foundations were being dug away." A shudder shook Bran MacMorn. The worms of the earth! Thousands of vermin digging like moles far below the castle, burrowing away the foundations. Gods, the land must be honeycombed with tunnels and taverns. These creatures were even less human than he had thought. What ghastly shapes of darkness had he invoked to his aid? "What of Titus Sulla?" he asked, again holding the flask to the legionary's lips. In that moment, the dying Roman seemed to him almost like a brother. "Even as the tower shuddered, we heard a fearful scream from the governor's chamber," muttered the soldier. "We rushed there. As we broke down the door, we heard his shrieks. They seemed to recede into the bowels of the earth. We rushed in. The chamber was empty. His blood-stained sword lay on the floor. In the stone flags of the floor, a black hole gaped. Then, the towers reeled. The roof broke through a storm of crashing walls. I crawled." A strong convulsion shook the broken figure. "Lay me down, friend," whispered the Roman. "I die." He had ceased to breathe before Bran could comply. The Pict rose, mechanically cleansing his hands. He hastened from the spot, and as he galloped over the darkened fens, the weight of the accursed black stone under his cloak was as the weight of a foul nightmare on a mortal breast. As he approached the ring, he saw an eerie glow within, so that the gaunt stones stood etched like the ribs of a skeleton in which a witch fire burns. The stallion snorted and reared as Bran tied him to one of the menhirs. Carrying the stone, he strode into the grisly circle and saw Atlas standing beside the altar, one hand on her hip, her sinuous body swaying in a serpentine manner. The altar glowed all over with ghastly light, and Bran knew someone, probably Atla, had rubbed it with phosphorus from some dank swamp or quagmire. He strode forward, and whipping his cloak from about the stone, flung the accursed thing onto the altar. "I've fulfilled my part of the contract," he growled. "And they theirs," she retorted. "Look, they come." He wheeled, his hand instinctively dropping to his sword. Outside the ring, the great stallion screamed savagely and reared against his tether. The night wind moaned through the waving grass, and an abhorrent soft hissing mingled with it. Between the menhirs flowed a dark tide of shadows, unstable and chaotic. The ring filled with glittering eyes, which hovered beyond the dim, elusive circle of illumination cast by the phosphorescent altar. Somewhere in the darkness, a human voice tittered and gibbered idiotically. Bran stiffened, the shadows of a horror clawing at his soul. He strained his eyes, trying to make out the shapes of those who ringed him, but he glimpsed only billowing masses of shadow which heaved and writhed and squirmed with almost fluid consistency. "Let them make good their bargain!" he exclaimed angrily. "Then see, O king!" cried Atla in a voice of piercing mockery. There was a stir, a seething in the writhing shadows, and from the darkness crept, like a four-legged animal, a human shape that fell down and groveled at Bran's feet, and writhed and mowed, and lifting a death's head, howled like a dying dog. In the ghastly light, Bran, soul-shaken, saw the blank, glassy eyes, the bloodless features, the loose, writhing, froth-covered lips of sheer lunacy. Gods, was this Titus Sulla? The proud lord of life and death in Aboricum's proud city? Bran bared his sword. "I had thought to give this stroke in vengeance," he said somberly. "I give it in mercy. Vale Caesar." The steel flashed in the eerie light, and Sulla's head rolled to the foot of the glowing altar, where it lay staring up at the shadowed sky. "They harmed him not!" Atla's hateful laugh slashed the sick silence. "It was what he saw and came to know that broke his brain. Like all his heavy-footed race, he knew nothing of the secrets of this ancient land. This night he has been dragged through the deepest pits of hell, where even you might have blanched. Well for the Romans that they know not the secrets of this accursed land," Bran roared, maddened. "With its monster-haunted meres, its foul witch women, and its lost caverns and subterranean realms where spawn in the darkness shapes of hell. Are they more foul than a mortal who seeks their aid?" cried Atla, with a shriek of fearful mirth. "Give them their black stone!" A cataclysmic loathing shook Bran's soul with red fury. "Aye, take your cursed stone!" he roared, snatching it from the altar and dashing it among the shadows with such savagery that bones snapped under its impact. A hurried babble of grisly tongues rose, and the shadows heaved in turmoil. One segment of the mass detached itself for an instant, and Bran cried out in fierce revulsion, though he caught only a fleeting glimpse of the thing, had only a brief impression of a broad, strangely flattened head, pendulous, writhing lips that bared curved, pointing fangs, and a hideously misshapen, dwarfish body that seemed modeled all set off by those unwinking reptilian eyes. Gods, the myths had prepared him for horror in human aspect, horror induced by bestial vestige and stunted deformity. But this was the horror of nightmare and the night. "Go back to hell and take your idol with you," he yelled, brandishing his clenched fist to the skies as the thick shadows receded, flowing back and away from him like the foul waters of some black flood. "Your ancestors were men, though strange and monstrous. But gods, ye have become in ghastly fact what my people called ye in scorn. Worms of the earth, back into your holes and burrows. Ye foul the air and leave on the clean earth the slime of the serpents ye have become. Gunnar was right. There are shapes too foul to use even against Rome." He sprang from the ring as a man flees the touch of a coiling snake and tore the stallion free. At his elbow, Atla was shrieking with fearful laughter. All human attributes dropped from her like a cloak in the night. "King of Pictland!" she cried. "King of fools! Do you blanch at so small a thing? Stay, and let me show you real fruits of the pits." "Run, fool, run! But you are stained with the taint. You have called them forth, and they will remember. And in their own time they will come to you again." He yelled a wordless curse and struck her savagely in the mouth with his open hand. She staggered, blood starting from her lips, but her fiendish laughter only rose higher. Bran leaped into the saddle, wild for the clean heather and the cold blue hills of the north, where he could plunge his sword into clean slaughter and his sickened soul into the red maelstrom of battle, and forget the horror which lurked below the fens of the west. He gave the frantic stallion the rein, and rode through the night like a hunted ghost, until the hellish laughter of the howling werewoman died out in the darkness behind.
The Children of the Night by Robert E. Howard. There were, I remember, 6 of us in Conrad's bizarrely fashioned study, with its queer relics from all over the world and its long rows of books which ranged from the Mandrake Press edition of Boccaccio to a Missale Romanum, bound in clasped oak boards and printed in Venice, 1740. Clements and Professor Kirwan had just engaged in a somewhat testy anthropological argument. Clements upholding the theory of a separate, distinct alpine race, while the professor maintained that this so-called race was merely a deviation from an original Aryan stock, possibly the result of an admixture between the southern or Mediterranean races and the Nordic people. "And how," asked Clements, "do you account for their brachycephalicism? The Mediterraneans were as long-headed as the Aryans. Would admixture between these dolichocephalic peoples produce a broad-headed intermediate type? Special conditions might bring about a change in an originally long-headed race," snapped Kirawan. "Boaz has demonstrated, for instance, that in the case of immigrants to America, skull formations often change in one generation. And Flinders Petrie has shown that the Lombards changed from a long-headed to a round-headed race in a few centuries. But what caused these changes? Much is yet unknown to science," answered Kirawan. "And we need not be dogmatic. No one knows, as yet, why people of British and Irish ancestry tend to grow unusually tall in the Darling district of Australia, cornstalks as they are called, or why people of such descent generally have thinner jaw structures after a few generations in New England. The universe is full of the unexplainable, and therefore the uninteresting, according to Mackin," laughed Taverell. Conrad shook his head. "I must disagree. To me, the unknowable is most tantalizingly fascinating." which accounts, no doubt, for all the works on witchcraft and demonology I see on your shelves," said Kettrick, with a wave of his hand toward the rows of books. And let me speak of Kettrick. Each of the 6 of us was of the same breed. That is to say, a Briton or an American of British descent. By British, I include all natural inhabitants of the British Isles. We represented various strains of English and Celtic blood, but basically, these strains are the same after all. But Kettrick, to me, the man always seemed strangely alien. It was in his eyes that this difference showed externally. They were a sort of amber, almost yellow, and slightly oblique. At times, when one looked at his face from certain angles, they seemed to slant like a Chinaman's. Others than I had noticed this feature, so unusual in a man of pure Anglo-Saxon descent. The usual myths ascribing his slanted eyes to some prenatal influence had been mooted out, and I remember Professor Hendrik Bruller once remarked that Kettrick was undoubtedly an atavism, representing a reversion of type to some dim and distant ancestor of Mongolian blood. A sort of freak reversion, since none of his family showed such traces. But Kettrick comes of the Welsh branch of the Settricks of Sussex, and his lineage is set down in the Book of Peers. There you may read the line of his ancestry, which extends unbroken to the days of Canute. No slightest trace of Mongoloid intermixture appears in the genealogy, and how could there have been such intermixture in Old Saxon England? For Kettrick is the modern form of Cedric, and though that branch fled into Wales before the invasion of the Danes, its male heirs consistently married with English families on the border marches, and it remains a pure line of the powerful Sussex Cedrics, almost pure Saxon. As for the man himself, this defect of his eyes, if it can be called a defect, is his only abnormality, except for a slight and occasional lisping of speech. He is highly intellectual and a good companion, except for a slight aloofness and a rather callous indifference, which may serve to mask an extremely sensitive nature. Referring to his remark, I said with a laugh, "Conrad pursues the obscure and mystic as some men pursue romance. His shelves throng with delightful nightmares of every variety." Our host nodded. "You'll find there are a number of delectable dishes: Mackin, Poe, Blackwood, Maturin. Look, there's a rare feast. Horrid Mysteries by the Marquis of Gros, the real 18th century edition." Taverell scanned the shelves. Weird fiction seems to vie with works on witchcraft, voodoo, and dark magic. True, historians and chronicles are often dull. Tale weavers never. The masters, I mean. A voodoo sacrifice can be described in such a dull manner as to take all the real fantasy out of it, and leave it merely a sordid murder. I will admit that few writers of fiction touch the true heights of horror. Most of their stuff is too concrete, given too much earthly shape and dimensions. But in such tales as Poe's Fall of the House of Usher, Mackin's Black Seal, and Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu, the 3 master horror tales, to my mind, the reader is born into dark and outer realms of imagination. "But look there," he continued. "There, sandwiched between that nightmare of Heisman's and Walpole's Castle of Otranto, von Juntz's Nameless Cults. There's a book to keep you awake at night." "I've read it," said Taverell, "and I'm convinced the man is mad. His work is like the conversation of a maniac. It runs with startling clarity for a while, then suddenly merges into vagueness and disconnected ramblings. Conrad shook his head. Have you ever thought that perhaps it is his very sanity that causes him to write in that fashion? What if he dares not put on paper all he knows? What if his vague suppositions are dark and mysterious hints, keys to the puzzle, to those who know? Bosh! This from Kirwan. Are you intimating that any of the nightmare cults referred to by von Yuntz survived to this day? If they ever existed, save in the hag-ridden brain of a lunatic poet and philosopher? Not he alone used hidden meanings, answered Conrad. If you will scan various works of certain great poets, you may find double meanings. Men have stumbled onto cosmic secrets in the past and given a hint of them to the world in cryptic words. Do you remember von Yuntz's hints of a city in the waste? What do you think of Fleeker's line? Pass not beneath. Men say their blows in stony deserts still arose, but with no scarlet to her leaf, and from whose heart no perfume flows. Men may stumble upon secret things, but von Yuntz dipped deep into forbidden mysteries. He was one of the few men, for instance, who could read the Necronomicon in the original Greek translation. Taveril shrugged his shoulders, and Professor Kirwan, though he snorted and puffed viciously at his pipe, made no direct reply, for he, as well as Conrad, had delved into the Latin version of the book, and had found there things not even a cold-blooded scientist could answer or refute. Well, he said presently, suppose we admit the former existence of cults revolving about such nameless and ghastly gods and entities as Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Sathagua, Golgoroth, and the like. But I cannot find it in my mind to believe that survivals of such cults lurk in the dark corners of the world today. To our surprise, Clemens answered. He was a tall, lean man, silent almost to the point of taciturnity, and his fierce struggles with poverty in his youth had lined his face beyond his years. Like many another artist, he lived a distinctly dual literary life, his swashbuckling novels furnishing him a generous income, and his editorial position on The Cloven Hoof affording him full artistic expression. The Cloven Hoof was a poetry magazine whose bizarre contents had often aroused the shocked interest of the conservative critics. You remember von Yuntz makes mention of a so-called brand cult, said Clemens, stuffing his pipe bowl with a peculiarly villainous brand of shag tobacco. I think I heard you and Taveril discussing it once. As I gather from his hints, snapped Kirwan, von Yuntz includes this particular cult among those still in existence. Absurd. Again, Clemens shook his head. When I was a boy, working my way through a certain university, I had for a roommate a lad as poor and ambitious as I. If I told you his name, it would startle you. Though he came of an old Scotch line of Galloway, he was obviously of a non-Aryan type. This is in strictest confidence, you understand. But my roommate talked in his sleep. I began to listen and put his disjointed mumbling together. And in his mutterings, I first heard of the ancient cult hinted at by von Yuntz, of the king who rules the Dark Empire, which was a revival of an older, darker empire dating back into the Stone Age, and of the great, nameless cavern where stands the Dark Man, the image of Bran MacMorn, carved in his likeness by a master hand while the great king yet lived, and to which each worshipper of Bran makes a pilgrimage once in his or her lifetime. Yes, that cult lives today in the descendants of Bran's people.
A silent, unknown current it flows on in the great ocean of life, waiting for the stone image of the great brand to breathe and move with sudden life, and come from the great cavern to rebuild their lost empire. And who were the people of that empire? Asked Ketrick.
Picts, answered Taverel.
Doubtless the people known later as the Wild Picts of Galloway were predominantly Celtic, a mixture of Gaelic, Cymric, Aboriginal, and possibly Teutonic elements. Whether they took their name from the older race or lent their own name to that race is a matter yet to be decided. But when von Jung speaks of Picts, he refers specifically to the small, dark, garlic-eating peoples of Mediterranean blood who brought the Neolithic culture into Britain. The first settlers of that country, in fact, who gave rise to the tales of earth spirits and goblins. I cannot agree to that last statement, said Conrad. These legends ascribe a deformity and inhumanness of appearances to the characters. There was nothing about the Picts to excite such horror and repulsion in the Aryan peoples. I believe that the Mediterraneans were preceded by a Mongoloid type, very low in the scale of development, whence these tales. Quite true, broke in Kirwan. But I hardly think they preceded the Picts, as you call them, into Britain. We find troll and dwarf legends all over the continent, and I am inclined to think that both the Mediterranean and Aryan people brought these tales with them from the continent. They must have been of extremely inhuman aspect, those early Mongoloids. At least, said Conrad, here is a flint mallet a miner found in the Welsh hills and gave to me, which has never been fully explained. It is obviously of no ordinary Neolithic make. See how small it is, compared to most implements of that age. Almost like a child's toy. Yet it is surprisingly heavy, and no doubt a deadly blow could be dealt with it. I fitted the handle to it myself, and you'd be surprised to know how difficult it was to carve it into a shape and balance corresponding with the head. We looked at the thing. It was made well, polished somewhat like the other remnants of the Neolithic I had seen, yet as Conrad said, it was strangely different. Its small size was oddly disquieting, for it had no appearance of a toy otherwise. It was as sinister in suggestion as an Aztec sacrificial dagger. Conrad had fashioned the oaken handle with rare skill, and in carving it to fit the head, had managed to give it the same unnatural appearance as the mallet itself had. He had even copied the workmanship of primal times, fixing the head into the cleft of the haft with rawhide. My word! Taverel made a clumsy pass at an imaginary antagonist and nearly shattered a costly Shang vase. The balance of the thing is all off-center. I'd have to readjust all my mechanics of poise and equilibrium to handle it. Let me see it. Ketrick took the thing and fumbled with it, trying to strike the secret of its proper handling. At length, somewhat irritated, he swung it up and struck a heavy blow at a shield which hung on the wall nearby. I was standing near it. I saw the hellish mallet twist in his hand like a live serpent, and his arm wrenched out of line. I heard a shout of alarmed warning. Then, darkness came with the impact of the mallet against my head. Slowly, I drifted back to consciousness. First, there was a dull sensation with blindness and total lack of knowledge as to where I was, or what I was. Then vague realization of life and being, and a hard something pressing into my ribs. Then the mists cleared, and I came to myself completely. I lay on my back, half beneath some underbrush, and my head throbbed fiercely.
Also, my hair was caked and clotted with blood, for the scalp had been laid open. But my eyes traveled down my body and limbs, naked, but for a deerskin loincloth and sandals of the same material, and found no other wound. That which pressed so uncomfortably into my ribs was my axe, on which I had fallen. Now an abhorrent babble reached my ears and stung me into clear consciousness. The noise was faintly like language, but not such language as men are accustomed to. It sounded much like the repeated hissing of many great snakes. I stared. I lay in a great, gloomy forest. The glade was overshadowed, so that even in the daytime it was very dark. Aye, that forest was dark, cold, silent, gigantic, and utterly grisly. And I looked into the glade. I saw a shambles. 5 men lay there, at least what had been 5 men. Now, as I marked the abhorrent mutilations, my soul sickened, and about clustered the things. Humans they were, of a sort, though I did not consider them so. They were short and stocky, with broad heads too large for their scrawny bodies. Their hair was snaky and stringy, their faces broad and square, with flat noses, hideously slanted eyes, a thin gash for a mouth, and pointed ears. They wore the skins of beasts, as did I, but these hides were but cruelly dressed. They bore small bows and flint-tipped arrows, flint knives and cudgels, and they conversed in a speech as hideous as themselves, a hissing, reptilian speech that filled me with dread and loathing. Oh, I hated them as I lay there. My brain flamed with white-hot fury. And now I remembered. We had hunted, we 6 youths of the Sword People, and wandered far into the grim forest which our people generally shunned. Weary of the chase, we had paused to rest. To me had been given the first watch, for in those days, no sleep was safe without a sentry. Now, shame and revulsion shook my whole being. I had slept. I had betrayed my comrades. And now they lay gashed and mangled, butchered while they slept, by vermin who had never dared to stand before them on equal terms. I, Aryara, had betrayed my trust. I remembered. I had slept, and in the midst of a dream of the hunt, fire and sparks had exploded in my head, and I had plunged into a deeper darkness where there were no dreams. And now, the penalty. They, who had stolen through the dense forest and smitten me senseless, had not paused to mutilate me. Thinking me dead, they had hastened swiftly to their grisly work. Now perhaps they had forgotten me for a time. I had sat somewhat apart from the others, and when struck, had fallen half under some bushes. But soon, they would remember me. I would hunt no more, dance no more in the dances of hunt and love and war, see no more the wattle huts of the Sword People. But I had no wish to escape back to my people. Should I slink back with the tale of infamy and disgrace? Should I hear the words of scorn my tribe would fling at me, see the girls point their contemptuous fingers at the youth who slept and betrayed his comrades to the knives of vermin? Tears stung my eyes. and slow hate heaved up in my bosom and my brain. I would never bear the sword that marked the warrior. I would never triumph over worthy foes and die gloriously beneath the arrows of the Picts or the axes of the wolf people or the river people. I would go down to death beneath a nauseous rabble, whom the Picts had long ago driven into forest dens like rats. And mad rage gripped me and dried my tears, giving in their stead a berserk blaze of wrath. If such reptiles were to bring about my downfall, I would make it a fall long remembered, if such beasts had memories. Moving cautiously, I shifted until my hand was on the haft of my axe. Then I called on Ilmarinen and bounded up as a tiger springs. And as a tiger springs, I was among my enemies and mashed a flat skull as a man crushes the head of a snake. A sudden wild clamor of fear broke from my victims, and for an instant they closed round me, hacking and stabbing. A knife gashed my chest, but I gave no heed. A red mist waved before my eyes, and my body and limbs moved in perfect accord with my fighting brain. Snarling, hacking, and smiting, I was a tiger among reptiles. In an instant, they gave way and fled, leaving me bestriding half a dozen stunted bodies. But I was not satiated. I was close on the heels of the tallest one, whose head would perhaps come to my shoulder, and who seemed to be their chief. He fled down a sort of runway, squealing like a monstrous lizard, and when I was close at his shoulder, he dived, snake-like, into the bushes. But I was too swift for him, and I dragged him forth and butchered him in a most gory fashion. And through the bushes I saw the trail he was striving to reach. A path winding in and out among the trees, almost too narrow to allow the traversing of it by a man of normal size. I hacked off my victim's hideous head, and carrying it in my left hand, went up the serpent path, with my red axe in my right. Now, as I strode swiftly along the path and blood splashed beside my feet at every step from the severed jugular of my foe, I thought of those I hunted. We held them in so little esteem. We hunted by day in the forest they haunted. What they called themselves, we never knew. For none of our tribe ever learned the accursed hissing sibilances they used as speech. But we called them children of the night. And night things they were indeed, for they slunk in the depths of the dark forests and in subterraneous dwellings, venturing forth into the hills only when their conquerors slept. It was at night that they did their foul deeds. The quick flight of a flint-tipped arrow to slay cattle, or perhaps a loitering human, the snatching of a child that had wandered from the village. But it was for more than this we gave them their name. They were, in truth, people of night and darkness, and the ancient, horror-ridden shadows of bygone ages. For these creatures were very old, and they represented an outworn age. They had once overrun and possessed this land, and they had been driven into hiding and obscurity by the dark, fierce little Picts, with whom we contested now, and who hated and loathed them as savagely as we did. The Picts were different from us in general appearance, being shorter of stature and dark of hair, eyes, and skin, whereas we were tall and powerful, with yellow hair and light eyes. But they were cast in the same mold. For all of that, these children of the night seemed not human to us, with their deformed, dwarfish bodies, yellow skin, and hideous faces. They were reptiles. Vermin. And my brain was like to burst with fury when I thought that it was these vermin on whom I was to glut my axe and perish. Bah! There's no glory slaying snakes or dying from their bites. All this rage and fierce disappointment turned on the objects of my hatred. And with the old red mist waving in front of me, I swore by all the gods I knew to wreak such red havoc before I died as to leave a dread memory in the minds of the survivors. My people would not honor me. In such contempt they held the children. But those children that I left alive would remember me and shudder. So I swore, gripping savagely my axe, which was of bronze, set in a cleft of the oaken haft, and fastened securely with rawhide. Now I heard ahead a sibilant, abhorrent murmur, and a vile stench filtered to me through the trees. Human, yet less than human. A few moments more and I emerged from the deep shadows into a wide open space. I had never before seen a village of the children. There was a cluster of earthen domes, with low doorways sunk into the ground, squalid dwelling places, half above and half below the earth. And I knew from the talk of the old warriors that these dwelling places were connected by underground corridors, so the whole village was like an ant bed or a system of snake holes. And I wondered if other tunnels did not run off under the ground and emerge long distances from the villages. Before the domes clustered a vast group of the creatures, hissing and jabbering at a great rate. I had quickened my pace, and now as I burst from cover, I was running with the fleetness of my race. A wild clamor went up from the rabble as they saw the Avenger, tall, blood-stained, and blazing-eyed, leap from the forest, and I cried out fiercely, flung the dripping head among them, and bounded like a wounded tiger into the thick of them. Oh, there was no escape for them now. They might have taken to their tunnels, but I would have followed, even to the guts of hell. They knew they must slay me, and they closed around, 100 strong, to do it. There was no wild blaze of glory in my brain as there had been against worthy foes. But the old berserk madness of my race was in my blood, and the smell of blood and destruction in my nostrils. I know not how many I slew. I only know that they thronged about me in a writhing, slashing mess, like serpents about a wolf, and I smote until the axe edge turned and bent, and the axe became no more than a bludgeon. And I smashed skulls, split heads, splintered bones, scattered blood and brains in one red sacrifice to Ilmarinen, god of the sword people. Bleeding from 100 wounds, blinded by a slash across the eyes, I felt a flint knife sink deep into my groin, and at the same instant a cudgel laid my scalp open. I went to my knees, but reeled up again, and saw in a thick red fog a ring of leering, slant-eyed faces. I lashed out as a dying tiger strikes, and the faces broke in red ruin. And as I sagged, overbalanced by the fury of my stroke, a taloned hand clutched my throat and a flint blade was driven into my ribs and twisted venomously. Beneath a shower of blows, I went down again. But the man with the knife was beneath me, and with my left hand I found him and broke his neck before he could writhe away. Life was waning swiftly. Through the hissing and howling of the children, I could hear the voice of Ilmarinen. Yet once again, I rose stubbornly, through a very whirlwind of cudgels and spears. I could no longer see my foes, even in a red mist. But I could feel their blows and knew they surged about me. I braced my feet, gripped my slippery axe haft with both hands, and calling once more on Ilmarinen, I heaved up the axe and struck one last terrific blow. And I must have died on my feet, for there was no sensation of falling, even as I knew, with a last thrill of savagery, that I slew, even as I felt the splintering of skulls beneath my axe. Darkness came with oblivion. I came suddenly to myself. I was half reclining in a big armchair, and Conrad was pouring water on me. My head ached, and a trickle of blood had half dried on my face. Kirawan, Tavro, and Clemens were hovering about, anxiously, while Ketrick stood just in front of me, still holding the mallet, his face schooled to a polite perturbation which his eyes did not show. And at the sight of those cursed eyes, a red madness surged up in me. "There," Conrad was saying. "I told you he'd come out of it in a moment. Just a light crack. He's taken harder than that. All right now, aren't you, O'Donnell?" At that I swept them aside, and with a single low snarl of hatred, launched myself at Ketrick. Taken utterly by surprise, he had no opportunity to defend himself. My hands locked on his throat, and we crashed together on the ruins of a divan. The others cried out in amazement and horror, and sprang to separate us, or rather, to tear me from my victim, for already Ketrick's slant eyes were beginning to start from their sockets. "For God's sake, O'Donnell!" exclaimed Conrad, seeking to break my grip. "What's come over you? Ketrick didn't mean to hit you. Let go, you idiot!" A fierce wrath almost overcame me at these men who were my friends, men of my own tribe, and I swore at them in their blindness as they finally managed to tear my strangling fingers from Ketrick's throat. He sat up and choked and explored the blue marks my fingers had left, while I raged and cursed, nearly defeating the combined efforts of the four to hold me. "You fools!" I screamed. "Let me go! Let me do my duty as a tribesman! You blind fools! I care nothing for the paltry blow he dealt me. He and his dealt stronger blows than that against me, in bygone ages. You fools, he's marked with the brand of the beast, the reptile, the vermin we exterminated centuries ago. I must crush him, stamp him out, rid the clean earth of his accursed pollution." So I raved and struggled, and Conrad gasped to Ketrick over his shoulder. "Get out, quick! He's out of his head! His mind is unhinged! Get away from him!" Now I look out over the ancient dreaming downs and the hills and deep forests beyond, and I ponder. Somehow, that blow from that ancient, accursed mallet knocked me back into another age and another life. While I was Aryara, I had no cognizance of any other life. It was no dream. It was a stray bit of reality wherein I, John O'Donnell, once lived and died, and back into which I was snatched across the voids of time and space by a chance blow. Time and times are but cogwheels, unmatched, grinding on oblivious to one another. Occasionally, oh, very rarely, the cogs fit. The pieces of the plot snap together momentarily and give men faint glimpses beyond the veil of this everyday blindness we call reality. I am John O'Donnell, and I was Aryara, who dreamed dreams of war glory and hunt glory and feast glory, and who died on a red heap of his victims in some lost age. But in what age? And where? The last I can answer for you. Mountains and rivers change their contours. The landscapes alter. but the downs least of all. I look out upon them now, and I remember them, not only with John O'Donnell's eyes, but with the eyes of Ariara. They are but little changed. Only the great forest has shrunk and dwindled, and in many, many places vanished utterly. But here, on these very downs, Ariara lived and fought and loved, and in yonder forest, he died. Kiruan was wrong. The little, fierce, dark Picts were not the first men in the Isles. There were beings before them. Aye, the children of the night. Legends. Why, the children were not unknown to us when we came into what is now the Isle of Britain. We had encountered them before, ages before. Already we had our myths of them. But we found them in Britain. Nor had the Picts totally exterminated them. Nor had the Picts, as so many believe, preceded us by many centuries. We drove them before us as we came, in that long drift from the east. I, Ariara, knew old men who had marched on that century-long trek, who had been born in the arms of yellow-haired women over countless miles of forest and plain, and who, as youths, had walked into the vanguard of the invaders. As to the age, that I cannot say, but I, Ariara, was surely an Aryan, and my people were Aryans, members of one of the 1,000 unknown and unrecorded drifts that scattered yellow-haired, blue-eyed tribes all over the world. The Celts were not the first to come into Western Europe. I, Ariara, was of the same blood and appearance as the men who sacked Rome, but mine was a much older strain. Of the language spoke, no echo remains in the waking mind of John O'Donnell. But I knew that Ariara's tongue was to ancient Celtic what ancient Celtic is to modern Gaelic. Ilmarinen! I remember the god I called upon, the ancient god who worked in metals, in bronze then. For Ilmarinen was one of the base gods of the Aryans, from whom many gods grew, and he was Wieland and Vulcan in the Ages of Iron. But to Ariara, he was Ilmarinen. And Ariara, he was one of many tribes and many drifts. Not alone did the sword people come or dwell in Britain. The river people were before us, and the wolf people came later. But they were Aryans like us, light-eyed and tall and blonde. We fought them, for the reason that the various drifts of Aryans have always fought each other, just as the Archaeans fought the Dorians, just as the Celts and Germans cut each other's throats. Aye, just as the Hellenes and the Persians, who were once one people and of the same drift, split in two different ways on the long trek, and centuries later met and flooded Greece and Asia Minor with blood. Now understand, all this I did not know as Ariara. I, Ariara, knew nothing of all these worldwide drifts of my race. I knew only that my people were conquerors, that a century ago my ancestors had dwelt in the Great Plains far to the east, plains populous with fierce, yellow-haired, light-eyed people like myself, that my ancestors had come westward in a great drift, and that in that drift, when my tribesmen met tribes of other races, they trampled and destroyed them, and when they met other yellow-haired, light-eyed people of older or newer drifts, they fought savagely and mercilessly, according to the old, illogical custom of the Aryan people. This Ariara knew, and I, John O'Donnell, who knows much more and much less than I, Ariara, knew, have combined the knowledge of these separate selves and have come to conclusions that would startle many noted scientists and historians. Yet this fact is well known. Aryans deteriorate swiftly in sedentary and peaceful lives. Their proper existence is a nomadic one. When they settle down to an agricultural existence, they pave the way for their downfall. And when they pen themselves within city walls, they seal their doom. Why I, Ariara, remember the tales of the old men. How the sons of the sword, on that long drift, found villages of white-skinned, yellow-haired people who had drifted into the west centuries before and had quit the wandering life to dwell among the dark, garlic-eating people and gain their sustenance from the soil. And the old men told how soft and weak they were, and how easily they fell before the bronze blades of the sword people. Look, is not the whole history of the sons of Aryan laid on those lines? Look, how swiftly has Persian followed Mede, Greek, Persian, Roman, Greek, and German, Roman. Aye, and the Norsemen followed the Germanic tribes when they had grown flabby from a century or so of peace and idleness, and despoiled the spoils they had taken in the Southland. But let me speak of Kettrick. The short hairs at the back of my neck bristle at the very mention of his name. A reversion to type. But not to the type of some cleanly Chinaman or Mongol of recent times. The Danes drove his ancestors into the hills of Wales. And there, in what medieval century and in what foul way did that cursed aboriginal taint creep into the clean Saxon blood of the Celtic line, there to lie dormant so long? The Celtic Welsh never mated with the children any more than the Picts did. But there must have been survivals, vermin lurking in those grim halls that had outlasted their time and age. In Ariara's day, they were scarcely human. What must 1,000 years of retrogression have done to the breed? What foul shape stole into the Kettrick castle on some forgotten night and rose out of the dusk to grip some woman of the line, straying in the hills? The mind shrinks from such an image. But this I know. There must have been survivals of that foul, reptilian epoch when the Kettricks went into Wales. There still may be. But this changeling, this waif of darkness, this horror who bears the noble name of Kettrick, the brand of the serpent is upon him, and until he is destroyed there is no rest for me. Now that I know him for what he is, he pollutes the clean air and leaves the slime of the snake on the green earth. The sound of his lisping, hissing voice fills me with crawling horror, and the sight of his slanted eyes inspires me with madness. For I come of a royal race, and such as he is a continual insult and a threat, like a serpent underfoot. Mine is a regal race, though now it has become degraded and falls into decay by continual admixture with conquered races. The waves of alien blood have washed my hair black and my skin dark, and I still have the lordly stature and the blue eyes of a royal Aryan. And as my ancestors, as I, Ariara, destroyed the scum that writhed beneath our heels, so shall I, John O'Donnell, exterminate the reptilian thing, the monster bred of the snaky taint that slumbered so long unguessed in clean Saxon veins, the vestigial serpent things left to taunt the sons of Aryan. They say the blow I received affected my mind. I know it but opened my eyes. Mine ancient enemy walks often on the moors alone, attracted, though he may not know it, by ancestral urgings. And on one of these lonely walks I shall meet him, and when I meet him, I will break his foul neck with my hands, as I, Ariara, broke the necks of foul night things in the long, long ago. Then they may take me and break my neck at the end of a rope if they will. I'm not blind, if my friends are. And in the sight of the old Aryan god, if not in the blinded eyes of men, I will have kept faith with my tribe. The Mirrors of Tuzan Thun by Robert E. Howard. There comes, even to kings, the time of great weariness. Then the gold of the throne is brass, the silk of the palace becomes drab. The gems in the diadem sparkle drearily like the ice of the white seas. The speech of men is as the empty rattle of a jester's bell, and the fuel comes of things unreal. Even the sun is copper in the sky, and the breath of the green ocean is no longer fresh. Kull sat upon the throne of Illusia, and the hour of weariness was upon him. They moved before him in an endless, meaningless panorama. Men, women, priests, events and shadows of events. Things seen and things to be attained. But like shadows, they came and went, leaving no trace upon his consciousness, save that of a great mental fatigue. Yet Kull was not tired. There was a longing in him for things beyond himself and beyond the Volusian court. An unrest stirred in him, and strange, luminous dreams roamed his soul. At his bidding, there came to him Brule the Spear Slayer, warrior of Pictland, from the islands beyond the west. Lord King, you are tired of the life of the court. Come with me upon my galleon, let us roam the tides for a space. Nay. Kull rested his chin moodily upon his right hand. I am weary beyond all these things. The cities hold no lure for me, and the borders are quiet. I hear no more the sea songs I heard when I lay as a boy on the booming crags of Atlantis, and the night was alive with blazing stars. No more do the green woodlands beckon me as of old. There's a strangeness upon me, and a longing beyond life's longings. Go! Brule went forth in a doubtful mood, leaving the king brooding upon his throne. Then to Kull stole a girl of the court and whispered, Great king, seek Tuzan Thun, the wizard. The secrets of life and death are his, and the stars in the sky, the lands beneath the seas. Kull looked at the girl. Fine gold was her hair, and her violet eyes were slanted strangely. She was beautiful, but her beauty meant little to Kull. Tuzan Thun, he repeated. Who is he? A wizard of the Elder race. He lives here in Volusia, by the Lake of Visions in the House of 1,000 Mirrors. All things are known to him, Lord King. He speaks with the dead and holds converse with the demons of the lost lands. Kull arose. I will seek out this mummer, but no word of my going. Do you hear? I am your slave, my lord. And she sank to her knees meekly. But the smile of her scarlet mouth was cunning behind Kull's back, and the gleam of her narrow eyes was crafty. Kull came to the house of Tuzan Thun, beside the Lake of Visions. Wide and blue stretched the waters of the lake, and many a fine palace rose upon its banks. Many swan-winged pleasure boats drifted lazily upon its hazy surface, and evermore there came the sound of soft music. Tall and spacious, but unpretentious, rose the House of 1,000 Mirrors. The great doors stood open, and Kull ascended the broad stair and entered, unannounced. There in a great chamber, whose walls were of mirrors, he came upon Tuzan Thun, the wizard. The man was ancient as the hills of Zalgara. Like wrinkled leather was his skin, but his cold gray eyes were like sparks of sword steel.
Skald of Cthulhu, my house is yours,
said he, bowing with old-time courtliness and motioning Kull to a throne-like chair. You are a wizard, I have heard, said Kull bluntly, resting his chin upon his hand and fixing his somber eyes upon the man's face. Can you do wonders? The wizard stretched forth his hand. His fingers opened and closed like a bird's claws.
Is that not a wonder? That this blind flesh obeys the thoughts of my mind. I walk, I breathe, I speak. Are they not all wonders?
Kull meditated a while, then spoke. Can you summon up demons?
I can summon up a demon more savage than any in Ghostland by smiting you in the face.
Kull started, then nodded. But the dead? Can you talk to the dead?
I talk with the dead always, as I am talking now. Death begins with birth, and each man begins to die when he is born. Even now you are dead, King Kull, because you were born.
But you are older than men become. Do wizards never die?
Men die when their times come. No later, no sooner. Mine has not come.
Kull turned these answers over in his mind. Then it would seem that the greatest wizard of Cthulhu is no more than an ordinary man, and I have been duped in coming here. Tuzan Thun shook his head.
Men are but men, and the greatest men are they who soonest learn the simpler things. Nay, look into my mirrors, Kull.
The ceiling was a great many mirrors, and the walls were mirrors, perfectly joined, yet many mirrors of many sizes and shapes.
Mirrors are the world, Kull,
droned the wizard.
Gaze into my mirrors and be wise.
Kull chose one at random and looked into it intently. The mirrors upon the opposite wall were reflected there, reflecting others, so that he seemed to be gazing down a long, luminous corridor, formed by mirror behind mirror. And far down this corridor moved a tiny figure. Kull looked long ere he saw that the figure was the reflection of himself. He gazed, and a queer feeling of pettiness came over him. It seemed that tiny figure was the true Kull, representing the real proportions of himself. So he moved away and stood before another.
Look closely, Kull. That is the mirror of the past,
he heard the wizard say. Gray fogs obscured the vision, great billows of mist, ever heaving and changing like the ghost of a great river. Through these fogs, Kull caught swift, fleeting visions of horror and strangeness. Beasts and men moved there, in shapes neither men nor beasts. Great exotic blossoms glowed through the grayness. Tall tropic trees towered high over reeking swamps, where reptilian monsters wallowed and bellowed. The sky was ghastly with flying dragons, and the restless seas rocked and roared and beat endlessly along the muddy beaches. Man was not. Yet man was the dream of the gods, and strange were the nightmare forms that glided through the noisome jungles. Battle and onslaught were there, and frightful love. Death was there, for life and death go hand in hand. Across the slimy beaches of the world sounded the bellowing of the monsters, and incredible shapes loomed through the streaming curtain of the incessant rain.
This is of the future.
Cole looked in silence.
See you. What?
A strange world, said Cole heavily. The 7 empires are crumbled to dust and are forgotten. The restless green waves roar for many a fathom above the eternal hills of Atlantis. The mountains of Lemuria of the west are the islands of an unknown sea. Strange savages roam the Elder Lands, and new lands flung strangely from the deeps, defiling the Elder Shrines. Volusia has vanished, and all the nations of today, they of tomorrow, are strangers. They know us not.
Time strides onward,
said Tuzan Thun calmly.
We live today. What care we for tomorrow or yesterday? The wheel turns and nations rise and fall. The world changes, and times return to savagery to rise again through the long age. Ere Atlantis was, Volusia was, and ere Volusia was, the elder nations were. We too, trampled the shoulders of lost tribes in our advance. You, who have come from the green sea hills of Atlantis to seize the ancient crown of Volusia, you think my tribe is old. We who held these lands ere the Volusians came out of the east, in the days before there were men in the sea lands. But men were here when the elder tribes rode out of the wastelands, and men before men, tribe before tribe. The nations pass and are forgotten, for that is the destiny of man.
Yes, said Cole. Yet is it not a pity that the beauty and glory of man should fade like smoke on a summer sea?
For what reason, since that is their destiny? I brood not over the lost glories of my race, nor do I labor for races to come. Live now, Cole. Live now. The dead are dead. The unborn are not. What matters men's forgetfulness of you when you have forgotten yourself in the silent worlds of death? Gaze in my mirrors, and be wise.
Cole chose another mirror and gazed into it.
That is the mirror of deepest magic. What see ye, Cole?
Not but myself.
Look closely, Cole. Is it in truth you?
Cole stared into the great mirror, and the image that was his reflection returned his gaze. I come before this mirror, mused Cole, chin on fist, and I bring this man to life. That is beyond my understanding, since first I saw him in the still waters of the lakes of Atlantis, till I saw him again in the gold-rimmed mirrors of Volusia. He is I, a shadow of myself, part of myself. I can bring him into being or slay him at will. Yet, he halted, strange thoughts whispering through the vast, dim recesses of his mind, like shadowy bats flying through a great cavern. Yet where is he,
when I stand not in front of a mirror? May it be in man's power thus lightly to form and destroy a shadow of life and existence? How do I know that when I step back from the mirror, he vanishes into the void of naught? Nay, by Valka, am I the man, or is he? Which of us is the ghost of the other? Mayhap these mirrors are but windows through which we look into another world. Does he think the same of me? Am I no more than a shadow, a reflection of himself to him as he to me? And if I am the ghost, what sort of a world lives upon the other side of this mirror? What armies ride there, and what kings rule? This world is all I know. Knowing naught of any other, how can I judge? Surely there are green hills there, and booming seas, and wide plains where men ride to battle. Tell me, wizard, who is wiser than most men, tell me, are there worlds beyond our worlds?
A man has eyes. Let him see.
Answered the wizard.
Who would see must first believe.
The hours drifted by, and Cole sat still before the mirrors of Tuzan Thun, gazing into that which depicted himself. Sometimes it seemed that he gazed upon hard shallowness. At other times, gigantic depths seemed to loom before him. Like the surface of the sea was the mirror of Tuzan Thun, hard as the sea in the sun's slanting beams, in the darkness of the stars, when no eye can perceive her deeps. Vast and mystic as the sea when the sun smites her in such way that the watcher's breath is caught at the glimpse of tremendous abysses. So was the mirror in which Cole gazed. At last the king rose with a sigh and took his departure, still wondering. And Cole came again to the House of 1,000 Mirrors. Day after day he came and sat for hours before the mirror. The eyes looked out at him, identical with his. Yet Cole seemed to sense a difference, a reality that was not of him. Hour upon hour he would stare with strange intensity into the mirror. Hour after hour, the image gave back his gaze. The business of the palace and of the council went neglected. The people murmured. Cole's stallions stamped restlessly in his stable, and Cole's warriors diced and argued aimlessly with one another. Cole heeded not. At times he seemed on the point of discovering some vast, unthinkable secret. He no longer thought of the image in the mirror as a shadow of himself. The thing, to him, was an entity, similar in outer appearance, yet basically as far from Cole himself as the poles are far apart. The image, it seemed to Cole, had an individuality apart from Cole's. He was no more dependent on Cole than Cole was dependent on him. And day by day, Cole doubted in which world he really lived. Was he the shadow, summoned at will by the other? Did he, instead of the other, live in a world of delusion, the shadow of the real world? Cole began to wish that he might enter the personality beyond the mirror for a space, to see what might be seen. Yet, should he manage to go beyond that door, could he ever return? Would he find a world identical with the one in which he moved? A world of which his was but a ghostly reflection,
which was reality and which illusion. At times, Kull halted to wonder how such thoughts and dreams had come to enter his mind, and at times he wondered if they came of his own volition, or here his thoughts would become mazed. His meditations were his own. No man ruled his thoughts, and he would summon them at his pleasure. Yet could he? Were they not as bats, coming and going, not at his pleasure, but at the bidding or ruling of whom? The gods? The women who wove the webs of fate? Kull could come to no conclusion, for at each mental step he became more and more bewildered in a hazy fog of illusory assertions and refutations. This much he knew, that strange visions entered his mind, like flying unbidden from the whispering void of non-existence. Never had he thought these thoughts, but now they ruled his mind, sleeping and waking, so that he seemed to walk in a daze at times, and his sleep was fraught with strange, monstrous dreams. "Tell me, wizard," he said, sitting before the mirror, eyes fixed intently upon his image. "How can I pass yon door? For of a truth, I am not sure that that is the real world, and this is the shadow. At least, that which I see must exist in some form."
See and believe,
droned the wizard.
Man must believe to accomplish. Form is shadow. Substance is illusion. Materiality is dream. Man is because he believes he is. What is man but a dream of the gods? Yet man can be that which he wishes to be. Form and substance. They are but shadows. The mind, the ego, the essence of the God dream, that is real. That is immortal. See and believe, if you would accomplish, Kull.
The king did not fully understand. He never fully understood the enigmatical utterances of the wizard. Yet, they struck somewhere in his being, a dim, responsive chord. So day after day, he sat before the mirrors of Tuzan Thun. Ever the wizard lurked behind him like a shadow. Then came a day when Kull seemed to catch glimpses of strange lands. There, fitted across his consciousness, dim thoughts and recognitions. Day by day, he had seemed to lose touch with the world. All things had seemed each succeeding day more ghostly and unreal. Only the man in the mirror seemed like reality. Now Kull seemed to be close to the doors of some mightier worlds. Giant vistas gleamed fleetingly. The fogs of unreality thinned.
Form is shadow. Substance is illusion. They are but shadows.
Sounded as if from some far country of his consciousness. He remembered the wizard's words, and it seemed to him that now he almost understood. Form and substance. Could not he change himself at will? If he knew the master key that opened this door, what worlds within what worlds awaited the bold explorer? The man in the mirror seemed smiling at him, closer, closer. A fog enwrapped all, and the reflection dimmed suddenly. Kull knew a sensation of fading, of change. of merging. Kull! The yell split the silence into a million vibratory fragments. Mountains crashed and worlds tottered as Kull, hurled back by the frantic shout, made a superhuman effort. How or why he did not know. A crash, and Kull stood in the room of Tuzan Thun before a shattered mirror, mazed and half-blind with bewilderment. There before him lay the body of Tuzan Thun, whose time had come at last, and above him stood Brule the Spear Slayer, sword dripping red and eyes wide with a kind of horror. "Valka," swore the warrior. "Kull, it is time I came." Yet, what happened? The king groped for words. "Ask this traitress," answered the Spear Slayer, indicating a girl who crouched in terror before the king. Kull saw that it was she who first sent him to Tuzan Thun. "As I came in, I saw you fading into yon mirror as smoke fades into the sky. By Valka, had I not seen, I would not have believed. You had almost vanished when my shout brought you back." "Aye," muttered Kull. "I had almost gone beyond the door that time." "This fiend wrought most craftily," said Brule. "Kull, do you not now see how he spun and flung over you a web of magic? Canoob of Blal plotted with this wizard to do away with you, and this wench, a girl of the elder race, put the thought in your mind so that you would come here. Kana of the council learned of the plot today. I know not what you saw in that mirror, but with it, Tuzan Thun enthralled your soul, and almost by his witchery he changed your body to mist." Kull was still mazed. But being a wizard, having knowledge of all the ages, and despising gold, glory, and position, what could Canoob offer Tuzan Thun that would make of him a foul traitor? "Gold, power, and position," grunted Brule. "The sooner you learn that men are men, whether wizard, king, or thrall, the better you will rule, Kull. Now what of her?" "Naught, Brule," as the girl whimpered and groveled at Kull's feet. "She was but a tool. Rise, child, and go your ways. None shall harm you." Alone with Brule, Kull looked for the last time on the mirrors of Tuzan Thun. Mayhap he plotted and conjured, Brule. Nay, I doubt you not. Yet, was it his witchery that was changing me to thin mist? Or had I stumbled on a secret? Had you not brought me back? Had I faded in dissolution? Or had I found worlds beyond this? Brule stole a glance at the mirrors and twitched his shoulders as if he shuddered. Aye, Tuzan Thun stored the wisdom of all the hells here. Let us be gone, Kull, ere they bewitch me too. Let us go then, answered Kull, and side by side they went forth from the House of 1,000 Mirrors, where, mayhap, are prisoned the souls of men. None looked now in the mirrors of Tuzan Thun. The pleasure boats shun the shore where stands the wizard's house, and no one goes in the house or to the room where Tuzan Thun's dried and withered carcass lies before the mirrors of illusion. The place is shunned as a place accursed, and though it stands for 1,000 years to come, no footsteps shall echo there. Yet Kull, upon his throne, meditates often upon the strange wisdom and untold secrets hidden there, and wonders. For there are worlds beyond worlds, as Kull knows, and whether the wizard bewitched him by words or by mesmerism, vistas did open to the king's gaze beyond that strange door. And Kull is less sure of reality, since he gazed into the mirrors of Tuzan Thun. The Black Stone by Robert E. Howard. They say foul things of old times still lurk in dark, forgotten corners of the world, and gates still gape to loose on certain nights, shapes pent in hell. Justin Joffrey. I read of it first in the strange book of von Junz, the German eccentric who lived so curiously and died in such grisly and mysterious fashion. It was my fortune to have access to his nameless cults in the original edition, the so-called Black Book, published in Dusseldorf in 1839, shortly before a hounding doom overtook the author. Collectors of rare literature were familiar with nameless cults, mainly through the cheap and faulty translation which was pirated in London by Bridewell in 1845, and the carefully expurgated edition put out by the Golden Goblin Press of New York, 1909. But the volume I stumbled upon was one of the unexpurgated German copies, with heavy black leather covers and rusty iron hasps. I doubt if there are more than half a dozen such volumes in the entire world today, for the quantity issued was not great, and when the manner of the author's demise was bruited about, many possessors of the book burned their volumes in panic. Von Junz spent his entire life, from 1795 to 1840, delving into forbidden subjects. He traveled in all parts of the world, gained entrance into innumerable secret societies, and read countless little-known and esoteric books and manuscripts in the original, and in the chapters of the Black Book, which range from startling clarity of exposition to murky ambiguity. There are statements and hints to freeze the blood of a thinking man. Reading what von Junz dared put in print arouses uneasy speculations as to what it was that he dared not tell. What dark matters, for instance, were contained in those closely written pages that formed the unpublished manuscript on which he worked unceasingly for months before his death, and which lay torn and scattered all over the floor of the locked and bolted chamber in which von Junz was found dead, with the marks of taloned fingers on his throat. It will never be known, for the author's closest friend, the Frenchman Alexis Ledoux, after having spent a whole night piecing the fragments together and reading what was written, burnt them to ashes and cut his own throat with the razor. But the contents of the published matter are shuddersome enough, even if one accepts the general view that they but represent the ravings of a madman. There, among many strange things, I found mention of the Black Stone, that curious, sinister monolith that broods among the mountains of Hungary, and about which so many dark legends cluster. Von Junz did not devote much space to it. The bulk of his grim work concerns cults and objects of dark worship which he maintained existed in his day, and it would seem that the Black Stone represents some order or being lost and forgotten centuries ago. But he spoke of it as one of the keys, a phrase used many times by him in various relations and constituting one of the obscurities of his work. And he hinted briefly at curious sights to be seen about the monolith on Midsummer's Night. He mentioned Otto Dostman's theory that this monolith was a remnant of the Hunnish invasion and had been erected to commemorate a victory of Attila over the Goths. Von Junz contradicted this assertion without giving any refutory facts, merely remarking that to attribute the origin of the Black Stone to the Huns was as logical as assuming that William the Conqueror reared Stonehenge. This implication of enormous antiquity piqued my interest immensely, and after some difficulty, I succeeded in locating a rat-eaten and moldering copy of Dostman's Remnants of Lost Empires, Berlin, 1809, Der Drachenhaus Press. I was disappointed to find that Dostman referred to the Black Stone even more briefly than had von Juntz, dismissing it with a few lines as an artifact comparatively modern in contrast with the Greco-Roman ruins of Asia Minor, which were his pet theme. He admitted his inability to make out the defaced characters on the monolith, but pronounced them unmistakably Mongoloid. However, little as I learned from Dostman, he did mention the name of the village adjacent to the Black Stone, Strigojkovar, an ominous name, meaning something like Witch Town. A close scrutiny of guidebooks and travel articles gave me no further information. Strigojkovar, not on any map that I could find, lay in a wild, little frequented region, out of the path of casual tourists. But I did find subject for thought in Dornley's Magyar Folklore. In his chapter on dream myths, he mentions the Black Stone and tells of some curious superstitions regarding it, especially the belief that if anyone sleeps in the vicinity of the monolith, that person will be haunted by monstrous nightmares forever after. And he cited tales of the peasants regarding two curious people who ventured to visit the stone on Midsummer Night, and who died raving mad because of something they saw there. That was all I could glean from Dornley, but my interest was even more intensely aroused as I sensed a distinctly sinister aura about the stone. The suggestion of dark antiquity, the recurrent hint of unnatural events on Midsummer Night, touched some slumbering instinct in my being, as one senses, rather than hears, the flowing of some dark, subterraneous river in the night. And I suddenly saw a connection between this stone and a certain weird and fantastic poem written by the mad poet Justin Joffrey, The People of the Monolith. Inquiries led to the information that Joffrey had indeed written that poem while traveling in Hungary, and I could not doubt that the Black Stone was the very monolith to which he referred in his strange verse. Reading his stanzas again, I felt once more the strange, dim stirrings of subconscious promptings that I had noticed when first reading of the stone. I had been casting about for a place to spend a short vacation, and I made up my mind. I went to Strigojkovar. A train of obsolete style carried me from Temesvar to within striking distance, at least, of my objective, and a 3 days' ride in a jouncing coach brought me to the little village which lay in a fertile valley high up in the fir-clad mountains. The journey itself was uneventful, but during the first day, we passed the old battlefield of Skomval, where the brave Polish-Hungarian knight, Count Boris Vladinov, made his gallant and futile stand against the victorious hosts of Suleiman the Magnificent, when the Grand Turks swept over Eastern Europe in 1526. The driver of the coach pointed out to me a great heap of crumbling stones on a hill nearby, under which, he said, the bones of the brave count lay. I remembered a passage from Larsen's Turkish Wars, after the skirmish, in which the count with his small army had beaten back the Turkish advance guard. The count was standing beneath the half-ruined walls of the old castle on the hill, giving orders as to the disposition of his forces, when an aide brought to him a small, lacquered case which had been taken from the body of the famous Turkish scribe and historian Selim Bahadur, who had fallen in the fight. The count took therefrom a roll of parchment and began to read. But he had not read far before he turned very pale and, without saying a word, replaced the parchment in the case and thrust the case into his cloak. At that very instant, a hidden Turkish battery suddenly opened fire, and the balls striking the old castle, the Hungarians were horrified to see the walls crash down in ruin, completely covering the brave count. Without a leader, the gallant's little army was cut to pieces, and in the war-swept years which followed, the bones of the noblemen were never recovered. Today, the natives point out a huge and moldering pile of ruins near Skomval beneath which, they say, still rests all that the centuries have left of Count Boris Vladinov. I found the village of Strogojkovar a dreamy, drowsy little village that apparently belied its sinister cognomen, a forgotten back-eddy that progress had passed by. The quaint houses and the quainter dress and manners of the people were those of an earlier century. They were friendly, mildly curious, but not inquisitive, though visitors from the outside world were extremely rare.
10 years ago, another American came here and stayed a few days in the village,
said the owner of the tavern where I'd put up.
A young fellow and queer acting, mumbled to himself. A poet, I think.
I think he must mean Justin Joffrey. Yes, he was a poet, I answered, and he wrote a poem about a bit of scenery near this very village. Mine host's interest was aroused.
Then, since all great poets are strange in their speech and actions, he must have achieved great fame, for his actions and conversations were the strangest of any man I ever knew.
As is usual with artists, I answered, most of his recognition has come since his death.
He is dead, then?
He died screaming in a madhouse 5 years ago.
Too bad,
sighed mine host sympathetically.
Poor lad. He looked too long at the black stone.
My heart gave a leap, but I masked my keen interest and said casually, I have heard something of this black stone. Somewhere near this village, is it not? Nearer than Christian folk wish, he responded.
Look.
He drew me to a latticed window and pointed up at the fir-clad slopes of the brooding blue mountains.
There, beyond where you see the bare face of that jutting cliff, stands that accursed stone. Would that it were ground to powder, and the powder flung into the Danube to be carried to the deepest ocean. Once, men tried to destroy the thing, but each man who laid hammer or maul against it came to an evil end. So now, the people shun it.
What is there so evil about it? I asked curiously.
It is a demon-haunted thing,
he answered uneasily, and with the suggestion of a shudder.
In my childhood, I knew a young man who came up from below and laughed at our traditions. In his foolhardiness, he went to the stone one midsummer night, and at dawn stumbled into the village again, stricken dumb and mad. Something had shattered his brain and sealed his lips. For until the day of his death, which came soon after, he spoke only to utter terrible blasphemies or to slaver gibberish. My own nephew, when very small, was lost in the mountains and slept in the woods near the stone. And now in his manhood he is tortured by foul dreams, so that at times he makes the night hideous with his screams and wakes with cold sweat upon him. But let us talk of something else. It's not good to dwell upon such things.
I remarked on the evident age of the tavern, and he answered with pride.
The foundations are more than 400 years old. The original house was the only one in the village which was not burned to the ground when Suleiman's devil swept through the mountains. Here,
In the house that then stood on these same foundations, it is said, the scribe Salim Bahadur had his headquarters while ravaging the country hereabouts. I learned then that the present inhabitants of Strigoi are not descendants of the people who dwelt there before the Turkish raid of 1526. The victorious Muslims left no living human in the village or the vicinity thereabouts when they passed over. Men, women, and children they wiped out in one red holocaust of murder, leaving a vast stretch of country silent and utterly deserted. The present people of Strigoi are descended from hardy settlers from the lower valleys who came into the ruined village after the Turk was thrust back. Mine host did not speak of the extermination of the original inhabitants with any great resentment, and I learned that his ancestors in the lower levels had looked on the mountaineers with even more hatred and aversion than they regarded the Turks. He was rather vague regarding the causes of this feud, but said that the original inhabitants of Strigoi had been in the habit of making stealthy raids on the lowlands and stealing girls and children. Moreover, he said that they were not exactly of the same blood as his own people. The sturdy, original Magyar Slavic stock had mixed and intermarried with a degraded aboriginal race until the breeds had blended, producing an unsavory amalgamation. Who these aborigines were, he had not the slightest idea, but maintained that they were pagans and had dwelt in the mountains since time immemorial, before the coming of the conquering peoples. I attached little importance to this tale, seeing in it merely a parallel to the amalgamation of Celtic tribes with Mediterranean aborigines in the Galloway Hills, with the resultant mixed race which, as Picts, has such an extensive part in Scotch legendary. Time has a curious foreshortening effect on folklore, and just as tales of the Picts became intertwined with legends of an older Mongoloid race, so that eventually the Picts were ascribed the repulsive appearance of the squat primitives, whose individuality merged in the telling into Pictish tales and was forgotten. So, I felt, the supposed inhuman attributes of the first villagers of Strigoi could be traced to older, outworn myths with invading Huns and Mongols. The morning after my arrival, I received directions from mine host, who gave them worriedly and set out to find the black stone. A few hours' tramp up the fir-covered slopes brought me to the face of the rugged, solid stone cliff which jutted boldly from the mountainside. A narrow trail wound up it, and mounting this, I looked out over the peaceful valley of Strigoi, which seemed to drowse, guarded on either hand by the great blue mountains. No huts or any sign of human tenancy showed between the cliff whereon I stood and the village. I saw numbers of scattering farms in the valley, but all lay on the other side of Strigoi, which itself seemed to shrink from the brooding slopes which masked the black stone. The summit of the cliffs proved to be a sort of thickly wooded plateau. I made my way through the dense growth for a short distance and came into a wide glade, and in the center of the glade reared a gaunt figure of black stone. It was octagonal in shape, some 16 feet in height and about 1.5 feet thick. It had once evidently been highly polished, but now the surface was thickly dinted, as if savage efforts had been made to demolish it. But the hammers had done little more than flake off small bits of stone and mutilate the characters which once had evidently marched up in a spiraling line round and round the shaft to the top. Up to 10 feet from the base, these characters were almost completely blotted out, so that it was very difficult to trace their direction. Higher up, they were plainer, and I managed to squirm part of the way up the shaft and scan them at close range. All were more or less defaced, but I was positive that they symbolized no language now remembered on the face of the earth. I am fairly familiar with all hieroglyphics known to researchers and philologists, and I can say with certainty that those characters were like nothing of which I have ever read or heard. The nearest approach to them that I ever saw were some crude scratches on a gigantic and strangely symmetrical rock in a lost valley of Yucatan. I remember that when I pointed out these marks to the archaeologist who was my companion, he maintained that they either represented natural weathering or the idle scratching of some Indian. To my theory that the rock was really the base of a long-vanished column, he merely laughed, calling my attention to the dimensions of it, which suggested, if it were built with any natural rules of architectural symmetry, a column 1,000 feet high. But I was not convinced. I will not say that the characters on the black stone were similar to those on that colossal rock in Yucatan, but one suggested the other. As to the substance of the monolith, again, I was baffled. The stone of which it was composed was a dully gleaming black, whose surface, where it was not dinted and roughened, created a curious illusion of semi-transparency. I spent most of the morning there and came away baffled. No connection of the stone with any other artifact in the world suggested itself to me. It was as if the monolith had been reared by alien hands, in an age distant and apart from human ken. I returned to the village with my interest in no way abated. Now that I had seen the curious thing, my desire was still more keenly whetted to investigate the matter further and seek to learn by what strange hands and for what strange purpose the black stone had been reared in the long ago. I sought out the tavern keeper's nephew and questioned him in regard to his dreams, but he was vague, though willing to oblige. He didn't mind discussing them, but was unable to describe them with any clarity. Though he dreamed the same dreams repeatedly, and though they were hideously vivid at the time, they left no distinct impression on his waking mind. He remembered them only as chaotic nightmares through which huge whirling fires shot lurid tongues of flame and a black drum bellowed incessantly. One thing only he remembered clearly. In one dream, he had seen the black stone, not on a mountain slope, but set like a spire on a colossal black castle. As for the rest of the villagers, I found them not inclined to talk about the stone, with the exception of the schoolmaster, a man of surprising education, who spent much more of his time out in the world than any of the rest. He was much interested in what I told him of von Juntz's remarks about the stone, and warmly agreed with the German author in the alleged age of the monolith. He believed that a coven had once existed in the vicinity, and that possibly all of the original villagers had been members of that fertility cult which once threatened to undermine European civilization and gave rise to the tales of witchcraft. He cited the very name of the village to prove his point. It had not been originally named Strigojkovar, he said. According to legends, the builders had called it Zuffeltan, which was the aboriginal name of the site on which the village had been built many centuries ago. This fact roused again an indescribable feeling of uneasiness. The barbarous name did not suggest connection with any Scythic, Slavic, or Mongolian race to which an aboriginal people of these mountains would, under natural circumstances, have belonged. That the Magyars and Slavs of the lower valleys believed the original inhabitants of the village to be members of the witchcraft cult was evident, the schoolmaster said, by the name they gave it, which name continued to be used even after the older settlers had been massacred by the Turks, and the village rebuilt by a cleaner and more wholesome breed. He did not believe that the members of the cult erected the monolith, but he did believe that they used it as a center of their activities, and repeating vague legends which had been handed down since before the Turkish invasion, he advanced the theory that the degenerate villagers had used it as a sort of altar on which they offered human sacrifices, using as victims the girls and babies stolen from his own ancestors in the lower valleys. He discounted the myths of weird events on Midsummer Night, as well as a curious legend of a strange deity which the witch people of Zolfaltan were said to have invoked with chants and wild rituals of flagellation and slaughter. He had never visited the stone on Midsummer Night, he said, but he would not fear to do so. Whatever had existed or taken place there in the past had been long engulfed in the mists of time and oblivion. The black stone had lost its meaning, save as a link to a dead and dusty past. It was while returning from a visit with the schoolmaster one night about a week after my arrival at Strigojkovar that a sudden recollection struck me. It was Midsummer Night, the very time that the legends linked with grisly implications to the Black Stone. I turned away from the tavern and strode swiftly through the village. Strigojkovar lay silent. The villagers retired early. I saw no one as I passed rapidly out of the village and up into the firs which masked the mountain slopes with whispering darkness. A broad silver moon hung above the valley, flooding the crags and slopes in a weird light and etching the shadows blackly. No wind blew through the firs, but a mysterious, intangible rustling and whispering was abroad. Surely on such nights in past centuries, my whimsical imagination told me, naked witches astride magic broomsticks had flown across the valley, pursued by jeering, demonic familiars. I came to the cliffs and was somewhat disquieted to note that the elusive moonlight lent them a subtle appearance I had not noticed before. In the weird light, they appeared less like natural cliffs and more like the ruins of Cyclopean and Titan-reared battlements jutting from the mountain slope. Shaking off this hallucination with difficulty, I came upon the plateau and hesitated a moment before I plunged into the brooding darkness of the woods. A sort of breathless tenseness hung over the shadows, like an unseen monster holding its breath lest it scare away its prey. I shook off the sensation, a natural one, considering the eeriness of the place and its evil reputation, and made my way through the wood, experiencing a most unpleasant sensation that I was being followed, and halting once, sure that something clammy and unstable had brushed against my face in the darkness. I came out into the glade and saw the tall monolith rearing its gaunt height above the sward. At the edge of the woods, on the side toward the cliffs, was a stone which formed a sort of natural seat. I sat down, reflecting that it was probably while there that the mad poet, Justin Joffrey, had written his fantastic People of the Monolith. Mine host thought that it was the stone which had caused Joffrey's insanity, but the seeds of madness had been sown in the poet's brain long before he ever came to Strigojkovar. A glance at my watch showed that the hour of midnight was close at hand. I leaned back, waiting whatever ghostly demonstration might appear. A thin night wind started up among the branches of the firs, with an uncanny suggestion of faint, unseen pipes, whispering in eerie and evil tune. The monotony of the sound and my steady gazing at the monolith produced a sort of self-hypnosis on me. I grew drowsy. I fought this feeling, but sleep stole on me in spite of myself. The monolith seemed to sway and dance, strangely distorted to my gaze, and then I slept. I opened my eyes and sought to rise, but lay still, as if an icy hand gripped me helpless. Cold terror stole over me. The glade was no longer deserted. It was thronged by a silent crowd of strange people, and my distended eyes took in strange, barbaric details of costume, which my reason told me were archaic and forgotten even in this backward land. Surely, I thought, there are villagers who have come here to hold some fantastic conclave. But another glance told me that these people were not the folk of Strigoi. They were a shorter, more squat race, whose brows were lower, whose faces were broader and duller. Some had Slavic and Magyar features, but those features were degraded as from a mixture of some baser, alien strain I could not classify. Many wore the hides of wild beasts, and their whole appearance, both men and women, was one of sensual brutishness. They terrified and repelled me, but they gave me no heed. They formed in a vast half-circle in front of the monolith and began a sort of chant, flinging their arms in unison and weaving their bodies rhythmically from the waist upward. All eyes were fixed on the top of the stone, which they seemed to be invoking. But the strangest of all was the dimness of their voices. Not 50 yards from me, hundreds of men and women were unmistakably lifting their voices in a wild chant. Yet, those voices came to me as a faint, indistinguishable murmur, as if from across vast leagues of space or time. Before the monolith stood a sort of brazier from which a vile, nauseous yellow smoke billowed upward, curling curiously in a swaying spiral around the black shaft, like a vast, unstable snake. On one side of this brazier lay two figures, a girl, stark naked and bound hand and foot, and an infant, apparently only a few months old. On the other side of the brazier squatted a hideous old hag with a queer sort of black drum on her lap. This drum she beat with slow, light blows of her open palms. But I could not hear the sound. The rhythm of the swaying bodies grew faster, and into the space between the people and the monolith sprang a naked young woman, her eyes blazing, her long black hair flying loose. Spinning dizzily on her toes, she whirled across the open space and fell prostrate before the stone, where she lay motionless. The next instant, a fantastic figure followed her, a man from whose waist hung a goat skin, and whose features were entirely hidden by a sort of mask made from a huge wolf's head, so that he looked like a monstrous nightmare being, horribly compounded of elements both human and bestial. In his hand, he held a bunch of long fur switches bound together at the larger ends, and the moonlight glinted on a chain of heavy gold looped about his neck. A smaller chain depending from it suggested a pendant of some sort, but this was missing. The people tossed their arms violently and seemed to redouble their shouts as this grotesque creature loped across the open space with many a fantastic leap and caper. Coming to the woman who lay before the monolith, he began to lash her with the switches he bore, and she leaped up and spun into the wild mazes of the most incredible dance I have ever seen. And her tormentor danced with her, keeping the wild rhythm, matching her every whirl and bound, while incessantly raining cruel blows on her naked body. And at every blow he shouted a single word, over and over, and all the people shouted it back. I could see the working of their lips, and now the faint, far-off murmur of their voices merged and blended into one distinct shout, repeated over and over with slobbering ecstasy. But what the one word was, I I could not make out. In dizzy whirls spun the wild dancers, while the lookers-on, standing still in their tracks, followed the rhythm of their dance with swaying bodies and weaving arms. Madness grew in the eyes of the capering votaress and was reflected in the eyes of the watchers. Wilder and more extravagant grew the whirling frenzy of that mad dance. It became a bestial and obscene thing, while the old hag howled and battered the drum like a crazy woman, and the switches cracked out a devil's tune. Blood trickled down the dancer's limbs, but she seemed not to feel the lashing save as a stimulus for further enormities of outrageous motion. Bounding into the midst of the yellow smoke which now spread out tenuous tentacles to embrace both flying figures, she seemed to merge with that foul fog and veil herself with it. Then emerging into plain view, closely followed by the beast thing that flogged her, she shot into an indescribable, explosive burst of dynamic mad motion, and on the very crest of that mad wave, she dropped suddenly to the sward, quivering and panting, as if completely overcome by her frenzied exertions. The lashing continued, with unabated violence and intensity, and she began to wriggle toward the monolith on her belly. The priest, or such I will call him, followed, lashing her unprotected body with all the power of his arm as she writhed along, leaving a heavy track of blood on the trampled earth. She reached the monolith, and gasping and panting, flung both arms about it and covered the cold stone with fierce, hot kisses, as in frenzied and unholy adoration. The fantastic priest bounded high in the air, flinging away the red-dabbled switches, and the worshippers, howling and foaming at the mouths, turned on each other with tooth and nail, rending one another's garments and flesh in a blind passion of bestiality. The priest swept up the infant in a long arm, and shouting again that name, whirled the wailing babe high in the air and dashed its brains out against the monolith, leaving a ghastly stain on the black surface. Cold with horror, I saw him rip the tiny body open with his bare, brutish fingers and fling handfuls of blood on the shaft, then toss the red and torn shape into the brazier, extinguishing flame and smoke in a crimson rain, while the maddened brutes behind him howled over and over the name. Then suddenly they all fell prostrate, writhing like snakes, while the priest flung wide his gory hands as if in triumph. I opened my mouth to scream my horror and loathing, but only a dry rattle sounded. A huge, monstrous toad-like thing squatted on the top of the monolith. I saw its bloated, repulsive, and unstable outline against the moonlight, and set in what would have been the face of a natural creature, its huge, blinking eyes, which reflected all the lust, abysmal greed, obscene cruelty, and monstrous evil that has stalked the sons of men since their ancestors moved blind and hairless in the treetops. In those grisly eyes were mirrored all the unholy things and vile secrets that sleep in the cities under the sea, and that skulk from the light of day in the blackness of primordial caverns. And so that ghastly thing that the unhallowed ritual of cruelty and sadism and blood had evoked from the silence of the hills leered and blinked down on its bestial worshippers, who groveled in abhorrent abasement before it. Now, the beast-masked priest lifted the bound and weakly writhing girl in his brutish hands and held her up toward that horror on the monolith. And as that monstrosity sucked in its breath, lustfully and slobberingly, something snapped in my brain, and I fell into a merciful faint. I opened my eyes on a still white dawn. All the events of the night rushed back on me, and I sprang up, then started about me in amazement. The monolith brooded gaunt and silent above the sward which waved, green and untrampled in the morning breeze. A few quick strides took me across the glade. Here had the dancers leaped and bounded until the ground should have been trampled bare. and here had the votaress wriggled her painful way to the stone, streaming blood on the earth. But no drop of crimson showed on the uncrushed sword. I looked, shudderingly, at the side of the monolith against which the bestial priest had brained the stolen baby. But no dark stain, nor grisly clot showed there. A dream. It had been a wild nightmare. Or else, I shrugged my shoulders. What vivid clarity for a dream. I returned quietly to the village and entered the inn without being seen. And there I sat, meditating over the strange events of the night. More and more was I prone to discard the dream theory. That what I had seen was illusion and without material substance was evident. But I believed that I looked on the mirrored shadow of a deed perpetrated in ghastly actuality in bygone days. But how was I to know? What proof to show that my vision had been a gathering of foul specters, rather than a nightmare originating in my brain? As if for answer, a name flashed into my mind. Salim Bahadur. According to legend, this man, who had been a soldier as well as a scribe, had commanded that part of Suleiman's army which had devastated Strigoi.
Like this stupid video. Let the algorithm gods know we exist.
And if
Chuck
so,
$1 my way and get access
he had
to
gone
an
straight from the
insulting
blotted
amount
out
of my special
countryside
brand of
to the
idiocy.
bloody field of
Or
Skull.
maybe a little more and get
and
some
his
really
doom.
cool stuff I make by hand.
I sprang up with a sudden shout.
Next one.
That manuscript, which was taken from the Turk's body, and which Count Boris shuddered over. Might it not contain some narration of what the conquering Turks found in Strigoi? What else could have shaken the iron nerves of the Polish adventurer? And since the bones of the Count had never been recovered, what more certain then that the lacquered case, with its mysterious contents, still lay hidden beneath the ruins that covered Boris Vladinov? I began packing my bag with fierce haste. 3 days later found me ensconced in a little village a few miles from the old battlefield, and when the moon rose, I was working with savage intensity on the great pile of crumbling stone that crowned the hill. It was back-breaking toil. Looking back now, I cannot see how I accomplished it, though I labored without a pause from moonrise to dawn. Just as the sun was coming up, I tore aside the last tangle of stones and looked on all that was mortal of Count Boris Vladinov. Only a few pitiful fragments of crumbling bone. And among them, crushed out of all original shape, lay a case whose lacquered surface had kept it from complete decay through the centuries. I seized it with frenzied eagerness, and piling back some of the stones on the bones, I hurried away, for I did not care to be discovered by the suspicious peasants in an act of apparent desecration. Back in my tavern chamber, I opened the case and found the parchment comparatively intact. And there was something else in the case. A small, squat object wrapped in silk. I was wild to plumb the secrets of those yellowed pages, but weariness forbade me. Since leaving Strigoi, I had hardly slept at all, and the terrific exertions of the previous night combined to overcome me. In spite of myself, I was forced to stretch myself on my bed, nor did I wake until sundown. I snatched a hasty supper, and then in the light of a flickering candle, I set myself to read the neat Turkish characters that covered the parchment. It was difficult work, for I am not deeply versed in the language, and the archaic style of the narrative baffled me. But as I toiled through it, a word or a phrase here and there leaped at me, and a dimly growing horror shook me in its grasp. I bent my energies fiercely to the task, and as the tale grew clearer and took more tangible form, my blood chilled in my veins, my hair stood up, and my tongue clove to my mouth. All external things partook of the grisly madness of that infernal manuscript, until the night sounds of insects and creatures in the woods took the form of ghastly murmurings and stealthy treadings of ghoulish horrors, and the sighing of the night wind changed to tittering, obscene gloating of evil over the souls of men. At last, when gray dawn was stealing through the latticed window, I laid down the manuscript and took up and unwrapped the thing in the bit of silk. Staring at it with haggard eyes, I knew the truth of the matter was clinched, even had it been possible to doubt the veracity of that terrible manuscript. And I replaced both obscene things in the case, nor did I rest nor sleep nor eat until that case containing them had been weighted with stones and flung into the deepest current of the Danube, which, God grant, carried them back into the hell from which they came. It was no dream I dreamed on midsummer night in the hills above Strigoi. Well, for Justin Joffrey, that he tarried there only in the sunlight and went his way, for he had gazed upon the ghastly conclave, his mad brain would have snapped before it did. How my own reason held, I do not know. No, it was no dream. I gazed upon a foul rout of votaries long dead, come up from hell to worship as of old, ghosts that bowed before a ghost, for hell has long claimed their hideous god. Long, long he dwelt among the hills, a brain-shattering vestige of an outworn age. But no longer his obscene talons clutch for the souls of living men, and his kingdom is a dead kingdom, peopled only by the ghosts of those who served him in his lifetime and theirs. By what foul alchemy or godless sorcery the gates of hell are opened on that one eerie night, I do not know. But my own eyes have seen. And I know I looked on no living thing that night, for the manuscript written in the careful hand of Selim Bahadur narrated at length what he and his raiders found in the valley of Strigoi. And I read, set down in detail, the blasphemous obscenities that torture wrung from the lips of screaming worshippers. And I read, too, of the lost, grim black cavern high in the hills, where the horrified Turks hemmed a monstrous, bloated, wallowing, toad-like being, and slew it with flame and ancient steel blessed in old times by Muhammad, and with incantations that were old when Arabia was young. And even staunch old Selim's hand shook as he recorded the cataclysmic, earth-shaking death howls of the monstrosity, which died not alone, for 60 of his slayers perished with him in ways that Selim would not, or could not, describe. And that squat idol, carved of gold and wrapped in silk, was an image of himself. And Selim tore it from the golden chain that looped the neck of the slain high priest of the mask. Well that the Turks swept out that foul valley with torch and cleanly steel. Such sights as those brooding mountains have looked on belong to the darkness and abysses of lost eons. No, it is not fear of the toad thing that makes me shudder in the night. He is made fast in hell with his nauseous horde, freed only for an hour on the most weird night of the year, as I have seen. And of his worshippers, none remains. But it is the realization that such things once crouched beast-like above the souls of men which brings cold sweat to my brow. And I fear to peer again into the leaves of Von Juntz's abomination. For now I understand his repeated phrase of keys. Aye, keys to outer doors. Links with an abhorrent past and, who knows, of abhorrent spheres of the present. And I understand why the cliffs look like battlements in the moonlight, and why the tavern keeper's nightmare-haunted nephew saw in his dream the black stone like a spire on a cyclopean black castle. If men ever excavate among those mountains, They may find incredible things below those masking slopes. For the cave wherein the Turks trapped the thing was not truly a cavern, and I shuddered to contemplate the gigantic gulf of eons which must stretch between this age and the time when the earth shook herself and reared up like a wave those blue mountains that, rising, enveloped unthinkable things. May no man ever seek to uproot that ghastly spire men call the Black Stone. A key. Aye, it is a key. Symbol of a forgotten horror. That horror has faded into the limbo from which it crawled, loathsomely, in the black dawn of the earth. But what of the other fiendish possibilities hinted at by von Jontz? What of the monstrous hand which strangled out his life? Since reading what Salim Bahadur wrote, I can no longer doubt anything in the Black Book. Man was not always master of the earth. And is he now? And the thought recurs to me. If such a monstrous entity as the master of the monolith somehow survived its own unspeakably distant epoch so long, what nameless shapes may even now lurk in the dark places of the world?